Everyone, please to take their seats, fasten your seat belts, and switch off your mobile phones or put them on airplane mode. Good morning. My name is Rathin Roy. I am director of the National Institute for Public Finance and Policy. This event, which has become more or less an institution, an annual institution, is co-hosted by 5 institutions from Delhi that have an interest in different dimensions of the budget as a policy and political document. My own institution, the National Institute for Public Finance and Policy, whose name is self-explanatory. This is our core business, and we're obviously interested in it. The Indian Council for Research in International Economic Relations, whose director is Rajat Kathuria. IDF is India Development Foundation. The India Development Foundation, whose director here is Dr. S.K. Shanthi, the extreme left. The National Council for Applied Economic Research, whose director is Shekhar, Shah here. And of course the CPR, the Center for Policy Research, whose director is Pratap, Bhanu, Mehta here. The first time I've actually mentioned all these 5 institutions in serial. It's interesting how much I have to struggle to differentiate the words. And we are very honored and pleased that Dr. A.K. Bhattacharya, editor of the Business Standard, has agreed to moderate this discussion today. Let me just, on behalf of everyone here, welcome you all to this event and institution. We hope to have a productive 2 hours of discussion. I'd also like, at the outset, to thank the World Bank for partnering with us in hosting this event. And all that remains for me to say, since you'll all be hungry at the end of this, presumably, is we would like to extend to you an invitation after this to continue the conversation over lunch, which will be served at the end of the seminar. So I'm handing over now to our moderator, Mr. A.K. Bhattacharya. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Good morning, Rathin, and it's a wonderful occasion. And thank you, Rathin, for conferring on me a degree of the doctorate. So, yeah. Well, that's not a good example. What we'll do is, in the next 160 minutes or so that we have at our disposal, we will try to look at the budget, the union budget that was presented last Monday, from 5 different perspectives. And the manner in which we hope to structure this discussion, which I'm sure will be very exciting, is that each of the 5 panelists will make a brief presentation. I managed to convince them that they must finish it between 10 and 15 minutes. So each of them will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes on their respective subjects, which they think are relevant for the budget and for this August gathering to understand and have their own takeaways. And then probably there should be a round of discussion among the panelists, which should not last for more than 1 question each, so that it sets the ball rolling for everybody to participate here. So with these words, let me start this morning's discussion. And may I invite, Rathin has already introduced all our distinguished panelists. May I now invite Rathin to come and make his presentation. And I'm told he will focus on macroeconomic fundamentals in the budget and also touch upon a bit on the tax areas. Am I right? Yeah.
Let me first lay out my overall impression of the budget, which is colored by the fact that, that I was very, very, very worried that a bad habit that has infested the government of India's fiscal commitments would be persisted with this time too. Because there were very influential people who felt it ought to be, and they had good reasons to do so, which is fiscal consolidation. So perhaps I'm colored because I was so worried that this government would deviate unnecessarily and, in my view, wrongly from the fiscal consolidation path, which is another story, that my take on this budget has been one of immense relief. the government has managed to maintain its fiscal consolidation commitments, not just this year, but for the next year as well. And more important for me, it has reduced its borrowing for consumption. You may quibble about what is in the revenue deficit, but I can assure you that the 0.3% that has been reduced is borrowing for consumption. And this is important because what I have been looking at in terms of, India in many ways has become a weaker state than it used to be. And one fiscal dimension of this weak state is the fact that the central government has increasingly resorted to borrowing for consumption, and since we borrow only from our own countrymen, and since we do not print money anymore, this means effectively when the government borrows more for consumption, others have less borrowing to do for investment. And this is very important, I think. So this is what it's looked like. It's quite alarming. This is the story of the fiscal sort of degradation of the Indian state, in my view. A partial story, but an important one. That is where we were in 1981-82 in terms of the ratio of borrowing for consumption to total borrowing. The RD, the revenue deficit fiscal deficit ratio. And if you look at what's happened, it just went up merrily till 2003, 2004, almost secularly. Then the good times rolled, and of course, some of that kicked back on the budget, but then we went back to bad habits. And I'm very, very happy that now I see, for the first time, a downturn in this ratio. And I could almost stop here, but there are certain other good things I want to talk about the budget and briefly touch on some bad things. How did this happen? Fiscal stance, 2.5%. The revenue deficit was cut by 2%, the fiscal deficit by 2%. Much of this has happened essentially through cuts in expenditure and an ambitious proposal to increase non-tax revenues, chiefly through a restructuring of the Government of India's public sector assets, with some net sales, obviously, and other non-tax revenues, especially things like Sectoral. So in the arithmetic, what you see is that non-plan revenue expenditure is slated to fall largely. A minor amount of non-plan capital expenditure is slated to fall. Total plan expenditure is in fact slated to rise, and total expenditure therefore is falling by about 0.03% of GDP. The important thing this year, unlike next year, is the total central assistance to the states, which fell sharply last year, is not falling anymore. In fact, it's slated to rise marginally. So in terms of the macro-fiscal numbers, therefore, what you have actually, and I'm not going to comment on the government's claims regarding their spending on this and spending on that, but if you look at it macroeconomically, this is the budget that is cutting. It's raising taxes a bit, but it's actually planning to cut expenditures too, and therefore, unless you have heroic expenditure switching, this is not a budget that is oriented towards spending on anything, development or otherwise, in my view, and we can take this up in the discussion. So that is not why I like the budget or dislike it. I like the budget because it sticks to fiscal consolidation. It's been a conservative budget. I acknowledge the government's need to say politically that it is an agriculture budget or, I don't know, a toys budget or whatever. But leaving that aside, I think this budget is good for these basic fundamental fiscal reasons. Therefore, I also want to point out, I do this every year now, everyone says that we need more public investment. You are not going to get that from the central government because the central government borrows to consume. And sure enough, if you look at the change in public investment projected as a percentage of GDP, it is zero. And if you look at the medium-term fiscal profile of government, what they're projecting, it is slated to be negative in 2018 too. So this is not a budget about increasing public investment. So much of that debate, I think, was on false premises. And this is what the budget very clearly reveals. Therefore, the major heavy lifters on public investment will continue to be the states of India. And that is where the action ought to be. I had no objection, given that the states as a whole more or less do not run a revenue deficit, if you wanted to increase fiscal consolidation, if you allowed state borrowing limits to increase, but that has not been proposed or done. In any event, that will continue to be the case, I think, in the foreseeable future. So focusing on the budget of the union government as a locus for public investment, I think, is misplaced, and this shows that you also all too clearly. It's been misplaced for quite some time now. All right. I will now briefly touch upon a couple of things so I stay within time. The other two reasons why I like this budget have nothing to do with where money is being spent. I have for a long time been worried and maintained that the biggest problem we have with the business of fiscal policy making in India is that the the business process of fiscal policy has been broken, hasn't been atrophying for a long time. And for the first time, I see in this budget certain unglamorous but very important reforms that make an attempt to address this critical issue. The first, if you look at Part B of the budget, and I said I'm going to talk about taxation, and I've never ever liked to talk about, taxes on pan masala versus, I remember Mr. Chidambaram, my column on Friday, he made a lot about reducing taxes on cat and dog food. And I don't like this because this is an example of a non-serious government with not much to do in a small economy. India is not that anymore. We are a large economy and we have a serious government. It is high time these kind of grandiose, sort of absurd, frankly, things stopped. Read my column if you want bipartisan examples of this from 1990-91. This time it has stopped because Part B of the budget, which deals with tax proposals, more than half of it is about business process changes, reducing litigation, providing certainty, simplifying the tax system, rationalizing the tax system. We can go through this in the discussion, the details, but I think this is absolutely fantastic. This is the first time I've seen a budget that is not populist on the tax front, that is not gestural on the tax front, that actually admits that it is possible for the government of India to have a better social contract with the taxpayer than it has in the past, and I must applaud this. The headline corporate tax rate, the business of making sure that the headline corporate tax rate begins to move somewhere to the real tax rate, the average effective tax rate, I beg your pardon, has begun. Not in full measure, partly due to legal constraints, but the process has been embarked upon and embarked upon transparently. Ministry of Finance put up on its website 4 months ago precisely the proposal in the budget and asked for comments. Disappointingly few comments were received. My suspicion is industry is so comfortable with the existing system of, doing sort of side deals on taxation that this was something that they found either not credible or irrelevant. Well, I think that has changed. And I think this move, signals that. On the expenditure front, which is where the government of India's business process is really, really broken, our expenditure management system is absolutely shameful, in my view. And I've said this before in public, and it's okay. It is shameful. Until we recognize it, it's like an alcohol problem. We're not going to do something about it. I think this government has. I was very worried at the complete absence of any report of the Expenditure Management Commission being put in the public domain, despite the fact that I know that they've produced quite a few. Dr. Jalan is here, so I won't speculate on the reasons why not. But on the positive side, I'm very happy that I would imagine, I can't see where this would have come from, certainly not from the Department of Expenditure. That's not what they do. They don't think about management reforms. I see many, many practical, credible, solid reform proposals to make structural changes in fiscal management in the public expenditure reform area. I like the idea that we are going to look at, as a social democrat, I don't like the idea of privatization for the sake of bringing in money to the fisc. I don't think we are that badly gone yet. That's resolution heading to bankruptcy. I don't think the Indian state is heading to bankruptcy. But I do like the idea that the government of India has an asset portfolio, and one needs to look at this asset portfolio and decide how to finance the acquisition of new assets in roads or power or whatever, agriculture, and look at what assets can therefore be sold and how they can be sold to do this. A comprehensive, medium-term asset management strategy where the people responsible for the strategy, this time NITI Aayog, are separate from the people involved in implementing it. That has actually happened. So I do not treat the change of name of the Department of Disinvestment to the Department of Investment and Public Asset Management as purely cosmetic. I would normally do so. I think this is serious, and I think this brings for the first time a strategic framework in that front, which I think is excellent. I've never liked the use of the word schemes to describe public spending initiative. It's so resonant of fiscal drag, pandering. This is not a word that is used in any other country I know. Yojana, scheme. Yojana is a plan, but it has sort of degenerated into scheme. I like the idea that every so-called scheme now will have a sunset date, and that sunset date will trigger an outcome review. And finally, I like the idea the government has decided to do away with the plan, non-plan classification. I live in hope. I'm an optimist. Finally, I hope, the government of India will be persuaded that events like this will become a thing of the past, and we will move to a modern, medium-term fiscal framework. No zamindari-style targets for tax, but tax GDP, tax target, tax forecasts based on the tax base and what we think is going to happen to it. for which people who do that are then accountable. An allocable ceiling which specifies what expenditure is committed and is not committed, a consistent investment strategy which empowers the line ministries then to decide what to do with their money, and an overall macroeconomic framework that specifies the government's growth and inflation aspirations. This brings about a medium-term rolling framework, which I think now the building blocks for are all in place. So this outdated, horrid budget execution system we now have the building blocks to move away from it. I am delighted. And finally, I read the review of the FRBM in this context. I do not think this is, I know what the markets are going to say. They're going to say, oh, the FRBM is just an excuse to, further relax fiscal consolidation. It may well do that. And I think it's always valid from time to time, once you have delivered in your commitments, to have a review of what we are targeting, how much we should target. That will be part of the conversation, sure. But I also think that the medium-term review that the government has proposed in the budget will also be about instituting a medium-term fiscal management system. I think, I hope, of course, and I think because I'm an optimist. So I live in hope that this will happen. And there are several other important reforms I won't go into. You can pick it up in the discussion, which I'm happy with. They've been happening for some time, rationalizing the centrally sponsored schemes, targeting some subsidies, Indian Financial Code, improving the ease of doing business. So these are the good things. There are some not bad things in this budget. There are some bad habits in this budget. And the most serious bad habit is this continued theft from the states, bipartisan theft from the states in the form of cesses. Swachh Bharat says, I don't know what says, startup says, I can't remember. But these are thefts because these are not shareable with the state governments. And that is not consistent with the spirit of intergovernmental fiscal relations. And to say, I think, Revenue Secretary said that, I'm going to criticize him for this publicly, that, oh, you see, with some of these cesses, they're on indirect taxes, and therefore, when GST comes, they'll go away anyway, so we're taking temporary advantage, I think is absolutely egregious. Why should you not share the temporary benefits of that too with the states? Why should the center have the priority to spend that money until GST comes? This is wrong, and I want to say very emphatically that this should not be encouraged and say that this is terrible. This is a theft from the divisible pool. It goes against the spirit of the Constitution and it should not be repeated. Okay. And here's a list of cesses. No time to go through them, but what a mess we have made. My God, just look at this. Just look at this. I mean, what? Is this a $2.3 trillion government? So here I do continue to criticize them. Too many exemptions and debates, but they made a start, so I will not focus on that. The share of subsidies in total expenditure has not fallen, despite a fall in fuel subsidies, and this worries me. This really does worry me. We can take it up in the discussion, but please note that. In the share of subsidies in total government expenditure, where the rupee goes, that has not fallen. And of course, let me conclude. This budget, therefore, what have I spoken on? I've spoken on two things, the macro-fiscal framework and the business process reforms. I think in both, this government has made remarkable strides, strides that I've not seen for many, many years. And for that, I recognize that this budget makes very grandiose claims. And that's natural. I mean, politicians have to be re-elected. They're going to seek to please political constituencies. So every budget makes grandiose claims. This one does too. And I'm as skeptical about them as many people are. So if somebody's going to tell me this budget does not provide more money to education, I have no disagreement with you. But I still support this budget because unlike other budgets which have promised in the past and failed to deliver on these counts, as this budget may well, it maintains prudence. It enhances, therefore, credibility of the government, which is very low, contrary to what many people in government seem to think. Credibility as a fiscal manager, and has initiated very important, unglamorous, media not interested structural reforms, which I think will serve the country well. For that reason, this budget has several public interest elements in it, and I commend it to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rathin, for this you stuck to the time given. And you also talked about some areas of concern, talked about the capex issue, which is indeed a cause for concern, that is declining, the theft from the states. And also, I think equally important is the lack of subsidies reform. So I think we'll come back to these issues. May I now invite Shekhar Shah of NCAER to speak on the sectoral issues in the budget, with particular reference to the infrastructure sector. Shekhar.
Thank you, Ashok, and it's really great to be here. at this 10th budget seminar. I'm the original culprit who started this when I was in the World Bank. And again, I'm grateful for all these years for the World Bank to support us. And it's great to have Ashok here. The one thing I do want to say is that the level of reporting on the budget has really improved dramatically in the years. And I think the Business Standard, of course, has taken a very good lead on that. And I absolutely loved your headline, which said that it's now up to the Governor of the Reserve Bank of India to take the lead. I'm going to speak about infrastructure, but also more about agriculture, because so many of us have thought about this as really return back to the roots type of budget. And indeed, I'll try and say a little bit about that. And, let me just start out by saying that I both love and hate this budget. I love it for all the reasons Rathin has pointed out. I think there are some very fundamental things that have happened, unglamorous, as he said, not much interest of the media in this, but clearly seminal and fundamental to improving what the budget should be doing in any country of our size. The sectors I'm going to cover: agriculture, farm and non-farm, infrastructure and industry. But I'll focus a lot on agriculture. And clearly this starts out in the very first two pillars that the FM put out amongst the 9 pillars, agriculture and farmers' welfare, and the very bold claim which Prime Minister Modi also made in 3 speeches that prefaced the budget, that he intends farm income to double by 21-22, and a big boost to the rural sector on infrastructure and employment. And you can see some of the allocations that are promising this kind of increased attention, which is not, of course, surprising given where the government is in its political cycle. Agriculture, which was largely ignored in the first 2 budgets, and I think the government perhaps paid for it, now has this dramatic increase from about 15,809 crores to about 36,000 crores, with, again, some of the famous cesses that Rathin pointed out now also finding their way in agriculture, and we will be faced with the Krishi Kalyan cess on our service tax obligations. The key farm proposals, and there are several of them, and again, this is going back. I think we are transitioning from the license Raj to the patronage Raj now to the scheme Raj. And I think we need to start thinking about where we are going in terms of not being able to bring the same kind of attention that was brought on the fiscal consolidation issue, and the FM referred to this, that he had conflicting views. And there are many in this audience and on the panel itself who are part of this side and that side views. I think mostly everybody on the panel here probably said consolidate. But I know that there are others in the audience who probably thought otherwise. That same kind of attention which says, look, this is so important, you cannot get away from this, perhaps now needs to be paid to the scheme Raj, where we need to start thinking about, this doesn't make sense. We need to be talking about principles. We need to be talking about level playing fields. We need to be talking about incentives, not this kind of, we have a scheme for everything. But you can see, as I'll go through this, that these are the allocations, with the largest, of course, being made, and I'll spend a little time on that, for the interest subsidy for short-term credit to farmers, which many, Ashok Gulati, I don't know if he's here, but many have pointed out, really was a transfer from the Ministry of Finance to the Ministry of Agriculture. But then there are the other schemes, the Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bima Yojana, I'll say a few words about that, the Rashtriya Krishi Vikas Yojana, the Mantri Krishi Sanchai Yojana, of course the National Food Security Mission, and the National Mission on Sustainable Agriculture. So we have this tendency to design a scheme for everything. And that, I think, is also a step in the wrong direction. The FM called the crop insurance scheme path breaking, and that was his big response, apart from the interest subvention, which has the largest allocation in the budget. This has the second largest allocation in the budget, and the government hopes to address the agrarian crisis. But when you think about it, as economists tend to, insurance markets are not the best markets to work. They fail very often in many places, with more advanced institutions than ours, more implementation capacity than ours, particularly in agriculture, where risks are highly correlated. If there is a drought, it's going to affect all the farms in a particular region. And secondly, where there's huge moral hazard, especially when you will subsidize premia, as the government will, it has to, because the probability of a drought is somewhere between 7 and 20% when you look at the historical data, which means that for an insurance of 1 lakh of rupees, the premia are going to be something like 14,000 to 20,000 rupees. Now, that is going to be a problem because clearly the government is going to subsidize that. When you subsidize premia, then there's additional risk-taking. Additional risk-taking will particularly happen in MSP crops because there is a base price there, and already distort further the crop choices that are being made under MSP. So when you think about the innards of a scheme, what looks very good really does not have the potential of really fundamentally changing the incentive structure and providing the kind of safety net that an insurance market is supposed to. Plus also the required infrastructure is not in place and probably won't be in place for a couple of years. So if there is a continuation of the El Nino effect, then we'll have a serious problem. I mentioned the interest subsidy on short-term credit. As I said, this was really a transfer from the Ministry of Finance to the Ministry of Agriculture. It is positioned at 15,000 crores, but it already was 13,000 crores in the last budget. And again, there's no clear framework to evaluate who enjoys the benefit of the scheme and therefore how it should be modified in the future. So this is one of the other problems that we face when we do scheme after scheme without worrying about who's picking up the pieces once a scheme is implemented, who's doing the learning, who's feeding back into the design of these programs. That remains a very serious problem. And again, the same kind of attention that has been paid to the fiscal architecture for the first time in many years, I hope can come to these sectoral issues. And again, it requires, I think, a kind of a compact, the kind of coming together of many economists who argued for fiscal consolidation. I think we need to bring that same kind of spirit to these sectoral issues as well, as opposed to the few lone voices who are very prominent. Irrigation, of course, does hold the ultimate key to greater productivity in agriculture. A few things have been done, and a lot has been promised. A new NABARD irrigation fund worth 20,000 crores, for which they've provided through both some provision in the budget plus borrowing, something like 12,500 crores. There's going to be a multilateral loan sought for a 6,000 crore groundwater management project, and they hope to get better projects and better outcomes from Manrega through small farm ponds and compost pits. So again, a whole series of things here, but the kind of effort that's needed really is massive compared to what has been done. The direction is perhaps right, but much more needs to be done on water resource management, because ultimately that is going to be the key to a sustainable and productive agriculture. There are a whole range of other things. I'm going to just breeze through these because this is just to illustrate that we touch upon everything. There's a scheme for everything. There's organic farming. The FM waxed eloquent about our honey production, as many of you may have noticed. And there are a whole range of things that apply. Marketing reform is clearly going to be very important. The government has made steps towards e-marketing with a common platform that hopefully begins to replace the PMC and the mandis. 12 states have reformed their mandi There are APMC acts, others need to follow for this to become universal. And I don't know what impact this will have, but it could be a very good opening. 100% FDI in marketing food products produced and manufactured in India through the Foreign Investment Promotion Board process. There's stuff on food security, 500 crores more. Important step, pulses now, which has been a problem. India is the largest producer and consumer of pulses, yet we do very little to improve the productivity of pulses, and I hope this will change with this attention. I'll just say a few things about the non-agricultural sector and then move on to industry and to infrastructure. The biggest allocation there for Manrega, this is a very bold political statement in climate where there's been 2 years of rural distress. There's going to be some piloting and targeted delivery of subsidies using Aadhaar, an substantial increase in rural roads with something like 27,000 crores expected in a combination of both central and state. A very important step, a small step, but a very important step, perhaps is going to be the increase in allocations to Gram Panchayats. And the problem there, of course, is independence, autonomy, and capacity. So this will increase the autonomy, but then will there be an increase in capacity of the Gram Panchayats? And I think that's a big question for the government, for the states, for NGOs and others working at the ground level. I'll just mention the last year, the Land Record Modernization Program. I happen to know a little bit about this because NCR may be working with the Ministry of Rural Development on this. This promises to be, if done well, for 8 years now the government has had this program in place. There is now rethinking on how this program can actually lead to an improvement of land records so that over a period of time, maybe 2 decades, maybe more, I don't know, we can actually get to conclusive titling in this area. As you can imagine, this has huge implications for unleashing the asset value of the land and a whole range of other areas that might be affected by improving our land records. Let me turn to then just my concerns where we have not dealt with a whole range of issues which I think this budget could have started dealing with. On fertilizer subsidy, very little movement. Of course, nothing on the food subsidy. And these together eat up so much of our development effort that it's perhaps too late now in the political cycle to deal with this, with the government already more or less at its halfway point. I hope Pratap will talk about this. But this was a great chance, given the firm stand taken on the fiscal position. This could have been something that we could have made important inroads into, and I think we've missed an opportunity. Infrastructure is the second biggest focus of the budget, and there the most positive development for me has been the grappling with the PPP model of infrastructure, with 2 important recommendations of the Kelkar Committee being implemented here. Disputes resolution bill to create the institutional arrangement for the many disputes that are holding up large PPP infrastructure projects. The problem has been that the government is very inviting at the beginning. Unfortunately, eminent domain seems to assert itself halfway through, and the terms of the agreement with the private player in a PPP contract seem to change, and that ends up inevitably in litigation or in some kind of arbitration. So an institutional arrangement that will streamline this and a kind of make or break. You can take a resolution and go with it, or you can choose to stay in litigation, I think will be very important. Also, guidelines for renegotiating these PPP concession agreements. The government officers who are given this responsibility are put in a very awkward position with the 3 C's behind them, the CBI, the CAG, and the CVC, that they cannot really take on the concerns of the private sector, which are of course profit-making, but there is a lot of issues with who's looking over their shoulders, and that this renegotiation agreement will be extremely important. here again, the off-budget items that are required for the tax-free infrastructure bonds, the National Investment Infrastructure Fund, are really problems that we still need to be addressing. And we haven't dealt with the capacity building that's needed within the government, both at the state level particularly, but also at the central level in terms of handling these PPP projects. Transport has had a big boost. Mr. Gadkari has again shown that he remains one of the most dynamic ministers and continues to push hard on roads, which of course is a very good thing. I'm going to skip over a couple of things and just get to my concerns so that I keep within my time. On the manufacturing and industry sector overall, I'm really concerned that there isn't really a rationalization on the external side. Again, we've fallen prey to the kind of import substituting adjustment of customs duties. We really didn't have to do that. And we've not really dealt with our poor export performance, which has a whole range of structural causes behind it. Very importantly, with the world moving to these mega trading blocks with TPP, APEC, and others, and of course we don't know what the political climate in the US will be come November and whether indeed TPP will go through. But we haven't taken any steps to align ourselves to these trading blocks, even to perhaps membership in APEC, which is a stated objective of the government of India. But we need to start taking steps in that direction. Let me stop here and come back on any of these issues in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shekhar, for this very lucid presentation. May I now invite Dr. Shanthi to make her presentation, and I understand she'll be speaking on the social sector outlay.
It's been a tradition in the seminar that IDF will represent the social sector, and today I do so in front of you. Overall, like the previous speakers, I also should applaud the finance minister for showing fiscal prudence in this budget. He has contained the fiscal deficit to 3.5% budgeted, and for last year the revised estimate seems to be right along the estimate put out in the beginning of last year. So having said that, I will be revisiting this particular issue a little bit later when I make my argument as to how possibly it happened. So in his budget speech, two of the 9 pillars that finance minister spoke about dealt with the social sector. One is relating to the healthcare and to cover all under welfare, and the other was education. And in education, special focus has been given only to skill development. And what is the increase in total central outlay on social sector this year compared to last year? It's a very modest 0.03% of GDP. So this is the amount of money that has been additionally allotted to the social sector for this year. Now, I would like to show you a little bit in detail. I mean, I'm sure many of you are already aware of the proposals that are there for the social sectors in the budget. And so I'll just briefly touch upon this. The first one, of course, is the Manrega, which has the highest allocation of 38,500 crores. Then Swachh Bharat has received 9,500 crores. From all reports, they are doing some good work, building a lot of toilets here and there. And there is this LPG for female members of the family. That's an excellent move in the right direction. 2,000 crores for 5 years for BPL families. And crop insurance scheme, about which Dr. Shah just spoke about. And health sector, there has been a good focus on the poorer sections of the people and their health needs and covering them through insurances. So a new health insurance scheme has been announced for 1 lakh up per family, and 30,000 extra for senior citizens. And there is some announcement on dialysis and kidney failure. Apparently there are 2.2 lakh renal patients added every year in India. This is a shocking number. Education, like I said, the focus has been on skill development and on entrepreneurship development. So some allocation, 1,700 crores has been allotted for skill development. And one of the nicest things I liked about the allocation to education is the 62 new Navodaya schools to be started. They are doing excellent work. And with this addition of the 62 schools, all the districts in India are going to be covered, and that's an excellent thing. And there is some talk on digital literacy mission. I was wondering whether it's going to be run along the lines of the national literacy mission of the early 90s. If it is done like that, perhaps it has a chance of succeeding, but it will require a lot of detailing to be done before it is launched. But it's a good move to even think about that. Now let's look at the numbers. I told you that the increase in the allocation has been 0.03% of the GDP. Now over the years, how has social services sector fared as percentage of GDP? Now if you just look at the central plan and non-plan expenditure, you see that it has been going up to about 2.09% in 2010-11. After that, there has been a downtick. So as a percentage of GDP, we have started investing less and less in social services since 2010-11. And from 14-15 onwards, if you see, post the 14th Finance Commission recommendations came into effect from 15-16. So 14-15, we see a dip, huge dip, and then there's a sort of leveling off, but it doesn't really go back to its old levels. This is as far as the central allocations are concerned. Then I wanted to look at the state allocations and see whether some of this decline in the central allocation has been offset in the state budgets. So that I do in the next slide. So over here, unfortunately for states, all states, I have data only till 2014-15, and those are also budget estimates. We have not received more recent data relating to the state. This is a major drawback, because I'm going to tell you later on that social sector nowadays, or in these years, is largely passed on to the state governments. And so for us to draw any conclusions about what is being done with this money, how it is being spent, and what are the outcomes coming out of these expenditures, we have to take a closer look at state government budgets and possibly not the central government budget. But this point I'll make a little bit later also. So this is what it is, 2014-2015 budget estimates. You see that there is a sort of an uptick happening since 12-13, and 6.5% is the total state allocation made to social sector services. Now in the last, this is all the data I'm going to give you, so bear with me. So in this I am looking at sector-wise, percentage spending with respect to the total central government budget. And different sectors that come within the social sector. I have not covered all of them. I have only taken the top 5, the most, the sectors that receive the most amount of money. The first one has always been education. Education has always received high amounts of allocation, whether it comes to the central government or whether it comes to the state governments. So here you can see that the corresponding to the first slide I showed you, we see a decline in almost all the education has fallen from about 5% of GDP to close to 2% now, and health also has fallen. And the one thing that has remained more or less steady is the housing and urban development. I think this is because a couple of years back there was a policy announced again in the budget about 100% housing, or housing for all was a scheme, and that has been in place and that is going on. So the budget allocation has come through for that. And labor and employment. And one of the things that really shocks you is the drinking water and sanitation. Now that has really gone to close to zero levels. In fact, in the budget, you don't even hear the finance minister mentioning drinking water and sanitation. So, but there is a good reason for that. So there is a good reason for that. And so I will talk about that after this slide, right? There's a good reason. Now, why do I bring in OECD countries? Because sometimes it's a good idea to see what the developed countries are doing. We are a country with a lot of challenges, huge challenges in the social sector. We don't have enough schools, we don't have enough hospitals. We hear of patients needing critical care being turned away from hospitals and only to die on the streets. I mean, this is the kind of thing that's going on in India. So anyway, so OECD countries, I thought, let's see what they're doing. It turns out that between 2007 and 2014, on an average, they have been spending 22% of their GDP on social services sector. And the highest is France at 32.5% of GDP, and the lowest is Mexico at 8%. India is lower than Mexico, and it is highest at 7.6% in 14, and the average during 7 to 14 has been 7.03% of GDP. So clearly, we need to spend more. But that may not be the full solution, but certainly some increased outlays are called for. What is India's Human Development Index? We still rank at 130. Guatemala and Namibia are ahead of us. Now, why do I bring in HDI at all? If you have to evaluate a social sector performance of the country, the developmental performance, it is directly linked to HDI. Three of the indicators that are used in computing the HDI, namely the longevity at birth, life expectancy at birth, enrollment in schools, and average number of years spent by Indians in schools. All these three come directly from the social sector services, and that is why I think it is important for us to see how we are performing there vis-a-vis the HDI. And all right, so I will leave it at this, and in my conclusions, I will try to draw some more, I'll argue a little bit more about this. So outlays have to increase, and we are simply not spending enough. 7% simply will not cut it, especially given the gaps that exist. 70% of India's population does not have sanitation. Now, without sanitation, what longevity can we expect? Just by being born in India, I expect to live, or on an average, Indians expect to live 13 years less than their developed counterparts. And this is, I think, an appalling situation. So what is the conclusion? So I told you right in the beginning that I have a slightly different take on this fiscal deficit getting contained. And so my argument is simply this. My argument is that a huge amount of money that the central government receives in terms of revenues has been transferred to the states. The 14th Finance Commission has straitjacketed our central government to such an extent that it doesn't have much money to spend. Therefore, the amount of money that it can additionally spend on various sectors is severely restricted. In addition, this year, if you have read the papers, you would find that every year there is a transfer of 2.87 lakh crores made directly to the local bodies. Now, out of this 2.87 lakh crores, 2 lakh crores is going to go directly to the panchayats, village panchayats. Now, that is a huge amount of money to come by for village panchayats. I worked with them in Tamil Nadu, and I know what state they are in. They don't have the capacity to even maintain proper accounts. They do not have the capacity to build roads. They do not have engineers. They don't have much talent. So capacity building has to be a part of this whole exercise. So I think the intent, this is actually 25 years after we liberalized and went on the path of reforms. And I think I see this as a second generation reforms where this fiscal federalism is really kicking in its fullest glory. And at least the financial devolutions are in place. State governments are getting a lot of money, and as are the local bodies and down to the panchayat level. But are they ready for the task? That is something, they will get ready eventually perhaps, but it is going to come after a huge investment in capacity building is put through. Otherwise, this could be a very costly experiment for all of us. Now, how has this happened? This financial devolution always goes hand in hand with functional devolution. So the central government, what they have done is, along with giving away the monies, well, not that they had a choice, along with the money went functions. And what were the major functions that got devolved to the lower levels of government? It is social sector services. So the social sector services, majority of the school education, for example, which is the critical thing in HDI that I was talking about, is now almost entirely in the hands of the state governments. And with the devolution to the local bodies and village panchayats, water and sanitation will go directly to the local bodies. So the functional devolution also has happened. So that is the reason why I think the central government has been able to contain its fiscal deficit by cleverly passing on many of these functions down to the lower levels of government. That is one thing. It's a welcome move because the local government, state government, they do know what the people want. They are more directly connected with the people. And fiscal federalism has a good chance to come up. But again, like I said, caveats are there. We need to build capacity. What is the next thing? Regardless of whether it is state government I'm talking to, local government or central government, I think we need to be more scientific in our policy making, especially when it comes to social sector. We are extremely scientific when it comes to monetary policy making. I hope you have noticed that. We are very, very scientific. We managed to contain a very contentious inflation rate, and that was through very, very careful analysis of domestic conditions, international developments, and so on. Why can't we have a similar scientific thinking applied to social sector? Do we even look at what outcomes do we study? I think we need to focus on the impacts of the various programs, because this is directly affecting the people. And well, everything directly affects the people, but this perhaps is more up close and personal, you know. And so I think we need to be more scientific, we need to be more evidence-based. And I had my reservations about crop insurance, but I will not touch upon that because that has already been spoken of. My only problem with that is that it is going to be unsustainable for the government, taking into account what has already been said on this. Now, the average number of years that Indians spend in schools is an appalling 5 years. Did you know that? I was quite shocked when I saw the UNDP report on the human development indicators, and it says that it is 5 to 5.5 years is the average number of years of schooling that Indians have. This is 2014 data. It is not all that dated. Now, given that, we are really dealing with, and enrollment rate is actually 11.1 number of years, you know. So that appears to be reasonable because the maximum is 18 years. 11.1 appears reasonable, so we are doing not too badly when it comes to enrollment, but the problem seems to be with dropouts. Because after enrollment, if only 5 years of schooling is completed, then we know that we have a gargantuan dropout problem. It's the kind of proportions I have not seen anywhere. IDF has been doing a project on analyzing this, funded by DFID, and I was kind of aware of that. Subhashish is leading the research there. I was kind of aware there, but when I saw these numbers, I was quite shocked. Now, weigh this against this focus on skill development. Now, do you really think that somebody who has gone to school for 5 years is capable of absorbing skills and becoming immediately employable? What sort of talents would this person have? And we are focusing on BPL and lower middle class families who are most likely to be in this 5 years of schooling bracket. So I don't know. Let's hope that the announcement is good. I think it's a good initiative. I think it needs to be done because school education should be more oriented towards jobs. All that is fine. As an educator, I've thought about this a lot. I've been a teacher all my life. But I think this is something that we need to address. What is it that we are looking for? Shouldn't we first strengthen our school education, especially the lower primary schools? Higher education, central government has increased the outlay this year. Most of the central government institutions are institutions of higher learning, and the budget allocation for them has gone up. But what is happening with schools? What are the states doing? And we need to look at this. Now, I will give you a small, I'll give you one of the research projects that is going on, that is being led by Subhashish in Odisha. This is about dropouts. Now, something like, the whole experiment is about setting up small learning clubs, which is basically groups of 15, 20 students. And the groups will have good performing students, in the sense that students doing well are part of that. Students who are not doing too well are also part of this group. And in the school, these groups are set up. Controls have been set up in other schools where this, controls are there, established. And where the group study is not there, these clubs are not there. And after having gone through this group-oriented learning, it is found out that not only have the poor performing students improved in their performance in terms of getting marks, but also the well-performing students. That was really very nice to discover that, sitting with average to lower average students is not bringing down the performance of the better performing students, it's actually improving it. And it's a zero cost experiment. Now, this is what I want, this is what I meant when I said we need to be more scientific. Scientific thinking means we need to be prepared to experiment. We need to be prepared to experiment. We need to learn from experiments. We need to be able to imbibe or incorporate the research findings into our policy making. This is the sort of thing we should be doing, especially in a country where money is scarce, especially in a country which is already spending very little. And this sunset clause is a very welcome thing, because always, government schemes will start and there will always be a desk somewhere in a ministry where the scheme has come and gone, but there will be some jobs, there will be somebody getting a salary, keeping the scheme alive. So it's a very good thing that we have something like a sunset clause, and I would have liked to have heard more on this from the finance minister. But what I would like to see is that we also need to have sunset clause for the beneficiaries of schemes. How long are the BPL people going to stay BPL? If somebody is below poverty line for 15 years, don't you think the policymakers should ask themselves, why are they still there? Why aren't they coming out of this? There are so many schemes that are there to benefit these people. Why are we still very happy with continuing these people under BPL? So there are issues, clearly. They continue as BPL because there are problems. I think a beginning has to be made in terms of understanding those problems and addressing them, and that is when perhaps this whole social sector development can happen in a way that really matters, not in terms of just budget allocation, numbers, etc., arithmetic games, but in a real sense. And I think that is all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shanthi. May I now invite Rajat Kathuria to come and speak to us about the trade and the budget and some of the budgetary provisions for international trade treaties, BEPS, etc.
Thank you, Ashok, and let me add my echo of thanks to Rathin and NIPFP for coordinating this year, and of course to Shekhar and NCAER for initiating this. This is a wonderful platform. We meet only once a year. We should meet more often as institutions and coordinate much better, but at least we meet once. So what I'm going to, as Ashok said, what I'm going to do is look at, and Shekhar has already mentioned this in his last slide, that there was not much on international trade in the budget, and the reason for that is a lot of it happens elsewhere. But while talking about international trade, I will then also talk a little bit about BEPS and the initiative that the government, the finance minister, has taken around BEPS. But before I get into the meat of the presentation, let me just say I agree completely with what Rathin started by saying, that there are lots of good things in the budget, what he got classified as unglamorous but critical. And if you read the economic survey of last year and this year, and even the budget speech of last year, the mention of this creative, persistent incrementalism in reform was the better way to go rather than big bang. And I think that approach is continuing. So that's the good thing in the budget. There are too many cesses and so on. So one wonders what kind of incrementalism that is. Hopefully those cesses will go away at some point. But the bad thing or the not so good thing in the budget, in the previous budget and this budget, is the lack of focus. And I think Shanthi touched upon this, and I think Pratap will, I dare say, talk much more about this, is the capacity to actually implement. And I think this was a time that the finance minister could have focused a little more on implementation. There are a couple of sentences in the summary of the budget speech that I will read out to you towards the end, where there is a focus on implementation, building capacity, both in central and the state. But I think a lot more needs to be done. And although the economic survey does say that we are not going to privilege, we shouldn't be privileging quality, quantity over quality, I think when you see the budget, there seems to be a persistence of although there is consolidation, but there are too many schemes there, and they need to be consolidated. So quantity, there's an emphasis on quantity, a less emphasis on quality, and quality then of course has to deal with the capacity to be able to implement the schemes that the government initiating. And then talk a little bit about coordination between bodies. So let me start by talking about trade and pick up from the point that Shekhar made, that there is very little in the budget on trade. There is a little bit, I mean, again, tinkering to aid domestic industry, which is bleeding under cheap price foreign imports. So there's some amount of protectionism, increasing of custom duties in certain sectors. But overall, I don't think the budget could have done enough to boost exports, which have been declining for the last 14 months. The exports have declined, and to boost that, those exports, you know, a lot of other things around infrastructure, manufacturing, etc., which I won't go, need to be done, and also maybe a little bit on the exchange rate, which I will talk about. So there's external vulnerabilities. Tom is sitting here. Maybe he could verify these figures if or validate these figures, unless the IMF has changed them since they were published late last year. There's a decline in the rates of growth in the world economy. There's slowdown, rebalancing in China, etc. All of that. So you know that the economic survey projects India's growth at 7.5%. Doesn't kind of gel or sink in with a number of other numbers that come out, which is the IIP, the export growth, and the corporate sales growth. So one doesn't know how these numbers are, one can reconcile these numbers. But the overall picture that emerges is on the external sector, the global demand is weak. India's exports have shrunk. Our growth rate, while is amongst the highest in the world, although China is falling, our growth rate is amongst the highest in the world, and one needs to reconcile this growth rate with a number of other real indicators coming out of India. Given the external vulnerabilities, given that the world demand is going to be weak, how will India's exports perform in the coming years? The picture doesn't look too bright, but although this has had a positive impact on our balance of payments. So current account deficit has gone down. It's now 1.4%. If you look at the numbers, you know, when this government took over, just before this government took over, the current account deficit was very, very high, close to 5%. Inflows have fallen, but the net capital inflows are still positive, 4.5% of GDP in 2015. Lately, they have fallen. Trade balance is negative, but rebalanced by, you know, historically by remittances and invisible exports. Remittances haven't tapered off too much, although there's FII outflow because of what's happening in the Middle East and the need for funds in the Middle East. There has been foreign institution outflow to the tune of almost $2.5 billion a month, and if you aggregate that to annually, that would result in about $25 billion outflow. That's a big amount and a cause for concern, and there's something in the budget to address that, and I will talk about this. But you know, we're doing some work in ICRIER, and I just want to mention this very, very quickly, and then talk a little bit about the schemes in the budget. The work revolves around how much of, and the economic survey also does talk about this in the first chapter, how much of our decline in exports is due to external causes and how much is due to internal causes. And we tried to kind of collect data from India's kind of major trading partners, and we looked at India's exports that go to about 70% of our trading partners, and it kind of weighted their GDP growth by our export shares in their GDP and ran some regressions and found, I won't bore you with the details, and there were controls for exchange rate and price, but what that research shows is that if our exports had grown the same according to trend, then our annual rate of growth of exports in the period 2008-9 to 2014-15 would have been about 5%. But in actual, the rate of growth of exports during this period is 1.17%, as you see here. So it's not, the results seem to suggest, and this is work in progress, these are early results, the work seems to suggest that maybe, and this is another working paper that has been brought out by ICRIER last year, which is that the real effective exchange rate shows persistent overvaluation. So maybe it's a combination of external demand, weakening of external demand, and overvaluation of the exchange rate, coupled with a number of things that we haven't incorporated in, we haven't created an infrastructure index and, cost of doing business, all of that typically would affect our competitiveness of exports. But income and price, the price elasticity and the income elasticity seem to suggest that income elasticity is not the only reason for the decline in our exports, and there's a persistent overvaluation of the real effective exchange rate. At current, the overvaluation is about 15%. During this period, it was about 9%. What has the government done? And Shekhar has already mentioned this. What has the government done to boost exports in or boost foreign investment inflows in the budget? Some measures that the government has announced. Government has widened and deepened the duty drawback scheme to include more products and countries, so that if you're exporting, then you get a duty drawback on your imports. Government has abolished the export duty on iron ore and chromium ores, reduced the export duty on bauxites and concentrates. So there's some tinkering at the margin. And then he has also announced that the profit-linked deductions will be available for new units in SEZs commencing activity before. So this is that sunset clause which, if you recall, applied to STPIs, which was extended. There was protests and it was extended by a few years. So the SEZs, the benefits, the profit-linked benefits were to expire. They've been continued until 2020, I dare say because of the situation with respect to exports. So overall, the concerns around exports and concerns around India's kind of exchange rate is that there is competitive depreciation, devaluation. We see that around. There is ICRIER shows persistent overvaluation of the Indian rupee, and even if you account for productivity gains, the Indian rupee continues to be overvalued. So that's on the trade front. And on the inflows front, as I mentioned, there have been rapid withdrawal of funds from the Indian market, although the government is trying to counterbalance that by the MAT exemption in the budget that was provided to companies is now being taken away, and so it will be, no MAT will apply to FII investments retroactively from 2001-2002, subject to the foreign company not having a PE, permanent establishment in India, under the relevant double taxation agreement treaty. So basically what this is doing is the MAT will not be applicable to FII investments in India that are booking profits. In any case, they do not book profits in India, so MAT should not be applicable. So this is something that the government has provided, which will make it hopefully easier for FII inflows, counterbalancing what is happening in the Middle East with the demand for funds due to lower commodity prices. So I've said all this, so I'm not going to, maybe happy to talk more about this in the discussion. The overall infrastructure problems relating to not only to trade but other aspects of production in India are GST, land acquisition, labor market reform, etc., bankruptcy code, which will probably be introduced. I think next year is what the finance minister announced. So the next focus of what I want to focus on is GAR and a new tax that has been introduced in this budget. Interestingly, and we don't know how it is going to evolve, media is calling it the Google tax, but this is this new equalization levy that has been introduced in the budget. But GAR has been postponed, and hopefully for the last time, I hope for the last time. So GAR needs to be implemented, just like GST needs to be implemented. There is assurance that retrospective taxation, which was introduced, if you recall, in the Finance Act 2012, will not be resorted to in the future. And there's a high-level committee that has been created to be chaired by Revenue Secretary, who would assure implementation of the assurances. And the transfer pricing disputes, where India, if you recall, I had made this presentation 2 years ago when Mr. Jaitley presented his first interim budget, and we got some data on the number of tax-related disputes that India was involved in, and out of all the tax-related disputes, international tax-related disputes, which amounted to about 70,000 crores at that time, 70% of all disputes were in India, which aggregated to 70,000 crores being at risk. I couldn't find a comparable number for this year, but as of May 2015, we found that there are 500 transfer pricing disputes were pending before the revenue authorities and various multinationals. So it's not a small number, still a large number of litigation between multinational and Indian tax authorities. And the government aimed to sign 120 advance pricing agreements by March this year, and CBDT has so far signed 41, and 38 are unilateral and 3 are bilateral. And there's another sum, I won't go through the details, but this transfer pricing offerer has the flexibility if the dispute has to be settled before 60 days. This flexibility will allow the matter to be settled, to be extended up to 60 days in certain cases. But a new thing, which I want to focus on just for a couple of minutes, which has been introduced in this budget, is the BEPS. BEPS is the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Action Plan, which is also a mandate under the G20. And the Finance Minister has proposed an equalization levy through the Finance Bill, not through the Income Tax Act, but through the Finance Bill 2016, at 6% for payment made to non-residents who make an income exceeding 1 lakh a year in case of B2B transactions. What this really means is that if you're advertising on either Google or Facebook, and you're paying them and their income exceeds 1 lakh a year, then it's not Facebook or Google that will be responsible for the tax, but the advertiser, the B2B advertiser, would be responsible to paying that tax of 6%. Now, it's not clear how the situation, I tried to see what the estimate of this tax equalization levy would be on the revenue of the budget. I couldn't get a number, but I dare say it would be somewhere embedded within the details. But the 6% tax is part of course, what the rest of the world is trying to do with taxation and BEPS. And if you recall, in January of this year, Google, agreed to pay some huge amounts of money to the UK government because it was avoiding paying a number of taxes because it was headquartered in Ireland, and Ireland is a tax haven, and all the book profits of Google through a complex maze of structuring go back to Ireland. And although Google has, I hope it's okay to name the company because this is all in the public domain, Google has incomes from the UK which exceeds income in Germany or in France, but Germany and France actually collect more taxes from Google than the UK does. So this raised an issue in the UK, and it was also discussed in the British Parliament, and this came out very recently in January. The point being that big multinational companies, especially technology companies, through a maze of how they structure the deals, have been able to avoid taxes. And I think the Indian government recognizes this, Ministry of Finance has recognized this, and has imposed this equalization levy. How this will evolve in terms of how this will affect domestic companies, like Snapdeal and Flipkart, and how this will affect Google. And some people, if you read the newspapers, some people are saying it'll just gross up, which means that Facebook and Google will start charging amounts which includes the 6% levy, so it'll gross up, and it'll actually affect the startups and the small entrepreneurs in India much more than it'll affect the multinationals. But this is essentially what the government is calling an equalization levy. So this is, I think, a big new change in this budget. Shekhar has also already talked about infrastructure, so I won't really go into that. Disinvestment, given the environment, there's been a cut of the target. And interestingly, a number that one should kind of be worried about is that most of the government's disinvestment that has been done in the recent past has been bought by LIC. So LIC is holding a lot of the shares that have been disinvestment. That could be a cause for concerns. So I will conclude. I want to make a couple of points which I said, what are the good things in this budget, as Rathin already mentioned, and what are the kind of mechanisms put in place to implement what the government has notified in this budget. I've talked about the trade vulnerabilities and the fact that our trade really is not completely being affected by global weaknesses. To an extent it is. but to an extent it is also affected by our own overvaluation of the exchange rate, and I dare say some other inefficiencies in the production. And Shekhar alluded to this, and happy to pick this up in the discussion. India's lack of participation in global value chains, logistics, and so on. So all of that probably play a role. I'm just going to wrap up to say that there are this 300 clusters on urban, smart cities, digital India. They're all in some way interconnected. And I just want to read out a couple of things from the summary document of the budget, which Rathin referred to as the good things, governance and ease of doing business. And he says the task force has been constituted for rationalization of human resources in various ministries. And what one means by rationalization, we will kind of get to know whether rationalization means downsizing or rationalization means improving human capital, human capacity. That's an important distinction. And I think we need better capacity, as Shekhar also mentioned, not only at the center, but at the state, and much more importantly, when we talk about cities, when we talk about governance, at the local level, at the municipal level, and that's where I think the capacity is the leanest. And this was an opportunity, as I said, to try and allocate some money for human capital development at the local level. Focusing on urban, while it's good, I think it could be a non-starter for a couple of reasons. And the reason urban could be a non-starter, if you recall Pura number of years ago, provision of urban amenities in rural areas. And if the intention is to stop migration from rural to urban areas by providing them employment opportunities there, it's going to be insufficient to start with. So there is going to be migration. We need to improve our cities. We need to improve our urban areas. But I think cities is where jobs are going to be provided. Cities is where people are going to be living in. And the numbers show that by 2020, I may be off by a few percentage points, not by 2020, in 20 years, in 2 decades, 75% of India's GDP is going to come from cities. 70% of net new jobs are going to be in cities. And, so urban, creating these clusters, maybe for transitory reasons, but the focus has to be on cities, and that's where the implementation capacity has to be improved a lot. Digital India is again the focus of this government. I'm finishing. Digital India is the focus of this government. Unfortunately, one of the biggest weaknesses, I think, of the Digital India, the direct benefit transfer schemes, all of that nice architecture that has been laid out to rationalize subsidies, and if it happens, great. But one of the biggest weaknesses of Digital India not rolling out as fast as it could is because for the last decade, we haven't been able to get connectivity to the Gram Panchayats that Sam Petroda had promised almost 10 years ago under what was called the National Optical Fiber Network. We have the money, and you don't need the money for the budget because the telecom sector cess, another cess, is already existing, and it has billions of dollars lying in what is called the USOF. And that cannot be, although I don't know what's happened to the fate of it, but the Act says that it cannot be appropriated by Parliament unless there is a vote in Parliament to appropriate that. And I don't know whether that vote has taken place or not, but there is huge amounts of money lying in the USOF. But the problem is not the money, the problem is the capacity and the procurement processes that haven't been possible to implement the NOFN. And I think NOFN, the National Optical Fiber Network, is the backbone for all these digital programs in India, especially in rural areas where connectivity suffers. So I think that needs on a kind of war footing that needs to be rolled out. I'm told DOT has started that process, and I wish them success because it's failed for a number of years. And then, of course, capacity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rajat. We now come to the last and perhaps the most interesting presentation. This is going to be on the politics of the budget.
He said, very good, doctor. I said, why? He said, did not administer any injections. The question is asked, but will the doctor cure you? He said, that I don't know. And I actually am getting a little worried listening to my colleagues, whether this budget has that quality. I agree with them. I think the temptation not to spend money, good thing. There's a lot of interesting institutional stuff in the budget, which, if it is followed through, new dispute resolution mechanism for PPPs, some good tax reforms, some good SME stuff, the whole bunch of stuff, Aadhaar potentially, if that kind of finally, that, in the long run could begin to address some, I think what Manish has called sort of chronic problems rather than acute problems. What I don't know, and I think this pertains to the politics of this and the psychology of the budget, is what's the problem the budget is trying to fix, and is it adequate to fixing that problem? I think that's the test. We've done the mathematical test of the budget, as it were, right? So let me first lay that out, and I know this is a controversial thing to say in the company of economists, but most of us ordinary citizens, and I think the globe, is very confused about what exactly is wrong with us. When you say 7 to 7.75%, there's actually nothing terribly wrong with us, right? Now, of course, we know it's under the new series, and of course we know, that's perfectly fine, but it doesn't feel like a 7.5% economy to anybody. And the government has caught itself in a bind, because if you had said our growth is 4.8% or 5%, then you would come up with a different diagnosis. Then the case for public investment, then the case for stimulating demand is there. We are so much into this management because we want to say that we don't actually have a crisis. We are the best growing economy in the world, right? So 7.75. Now, once you put yourself into that trap, you actually can't ask very hard questions about how much of a deep hole are you actually in. So my first political problem with the budget, and I think it's a problem in the perception of this budget, is actually there is no honesty about that. The economic survey is actually very clear that we are in a really, really deep hole, right? But every assumption you have made about what needs to be fixed cannot acknowledge that deep hole. Okay? So that's the first problem, and I think it is a political problem. It is a political problem because the only thing you can claim credit for is that we have 7 to 7.5 growth, right? That's the headline of the last 2 years of economic achievement, very little else, right? So I'm afraid the politics has contaminated the economic presentation of the argument, and I think as intellectuals we are collaborating with that, frankly. Okay? The second thing that worries me about this budget, and there, it's not a worry about the budget itself. In fact, I think the budget is actually, I'd say it's reflecting actually a deeply pessimistic psychology about India. Okay, and I think one should lay that pessimism on the table. Why is it pessimistic? Why have we restrained ourselves in public spending, right? And of course, there's the issue of states will do more of it. I actually think the one thing politicians are right about, and I think this is, nobody saying this, but this is the underlying assumption, is public spending, even consumption spending, will have to explode over the next 2 years. The rural distress, unless we are lucky with a great monsoon this year, is going to deepen. The follow-through of the 7th Pay Commission for states is always immensely disruptive. Rathin knows this, that there's been more devolution to the states in terms of the Finance Commission allocations. But the sorting out of the state's committed liabilities under all centrally sponsored schemes, most state governments actually don't know how much money they're going to have compared to their liabilities over the next 2 or 3 years. So I think implicitly, and this is a good reason to be prudent right now, but implicitly the government is actually acknowledging we actually don't know how this revenue stuff is going to pan out over the next 2 or 3 years. I won't celebrate too prematurely this cutting down on revenue. I think the politicians, I think understand that this dynamic is actually not looking good over the next 2 or 3 years. Okay? And we don't have, in a sense, a sort of a, so it's pessimistic in that sense. Okay? What seems like an achievement is born out of deep pessimism on the revenue. It's pessimistic in a second sense, which is there's no underlying sense of the diagnosis. And if one were being fair to the government, we could say something like the following, which is, certainly the global uncertainty is playing a big part in the lack of revival of private investment. I mean, we are entering into uncharted waters, right? And again, the government was a prisoner of its own mythology. You know, slowdown of China is good for us. The slowdown of any major economy in the world is not good for anybody else in the world, okay? Now, and we are entering into uncharted global deflation, competitive devaluations of a different kind are back. If you were private capital, your biggest question, I just don't know what world I'm entering in, right? So that's one hypothesis for why private investment is not picking up. Second hypothesis of private investment is, of course, all the crony capitalist story, the stuck assets, whether we have mechanisms for renegotiating that. And it's different in different sectors. In real estate, it's an entirely a crony capitalist story, right? And the emphasis in this budget on trying to sort of rescue the real estate sector with even more concessions, rather than getting the DLFs and the Unitex of the world to come to heel and drive hard bargains, is quite worrying. A lot of money in an incredibly corrupt, malpriced sector, right? And this is the one sector that has got the biggest infusion in tax base in this budget. So I'm not too happy about that part of it. The other side, you know, renegotiative assets in the power sector and stuff, the government has been slow on it. To its credit, it's recognized the problem, but let's be clear, this is at least a 2-year process. Partly because Indian capital, I think, is slow to wake up to the new realities of India, right? I think the Indian state will actually become more regulatorily consistent. I don't think Indian capital is ready to play by the new transparent rules. So it's like who blinks first, and looks like in the real estate, the government has blinked first. Yeah? Third sense in which it's a deeply pessimistic budget, absolutely everybody talks about state capacity. Rajat rightly mentioned it. You know, there is no getting around the fact that state capacity is going to cost a lot of money upfront. We have been deluding ourselves. Of course, there's a problem of inefficiency and some misallocation within the state. But you're living in a fool's paradise, right? If you think you can build state capacity with it without investing in the state, basic sovereign functions, law and justice, right? Where is the investment, right? Basic sovereign functions like police, where is the investment? Basic sovereign functions like, you know, capacity building at the lower level, where is the investment? There is no strategy for the state. And you cannot think of a 21st century successful economy without a strategy for the state. All we have heard, I mean, you know, this is the problem with our reform discourse, which is we keep saying state capacity is not going to, capacity is very expensive. Statisticians are very expensive. You have a broken down statistical system in the state, right? I'd love to see an incredible investment in India's statistical apparatus. You can't do health interventions because you don't have an epidemiological mapping of the country, right? Zero investment in state capacity, right? So in all of those things that actually matter, it is actually a deeply pessimistic budget. It's basically saying, let's be prudent because we are not sure. It's, you know, uncertain trajectory. We don't know what to do with the state, as it were, and we don't know what this underlying kind of diagnosis is. What also politically worries me about this budget, no matter what your ideological views on the government, and you know the government evokes strong ideological feelings, there was one school of thought that this government has made a political pact with the extreme right, which is you do the culture stuff, you let us do the economy stuff, right? That was the sort of the contract within the party. That's how, right? I'm actually beginning to think that the lack of political boldness in the budget, and political boldness means this government has not taken a single political risk in its 2 years in power, actually suggests something deeper. What it suggests is it is actually going to invest all its political capital fighting those culture battles and not do the hard economic stuff. You know, which is different from as sinister as that older social contract was, you take care of culture, we'll take care of economics. It's actually, no, we are going to spend all our political capital on politics. And I think the beginning in Parliament is a very clear indication of that, right? So don't expect great and deep investments in political capital, right? On the politics side of it, the investment in the social sector, very deeply worrying. It's very deeply worrying for a couple of reasons. Of course, again, it's an illusion to think these sectors are not going to cost money. I think Shanthi is absolutely right about that. UGC allocations have been slashed. Very clear indication that this government is not going to, does not see a future for public universities. Okay, it's very clear. If you don't read the writing on the wall, you're living in a fool's paradise. Okay, you cannot imagine again a vibrant 21st century economy. And India, is in this position. It's both our challenge and opportunity that it has to do everything together. You have to be in the high value added research end of this thing, and you have to be in the private, in the primary end of the scale, right? Very clear indication this government doesn't even begin to understand what the issues are with education and has absolutely zero commitment to reforming it in any meaningful way. Okay? But the health and education story is also important for the other economic side of the story. I mean, as you know, almost everybody in the private consultancy business has been saying over and over again, we don't know how health and education is priced in this country, right? These are probably the sectors with the two highest degrees of inflation, probably absorb income increases the greatest, right? So if you're serious about stimulating other kinds of demand, you need to tackle health and education. I mean, Piketty gets a bad name in this country. I don't know quite why, but one of the very important points he makes, you'll have inflated GDPs when you have greater private health and education, right? So even if you want the demand side of the story to continue, right, you need to invest in health and education. And there's no conception, there's no framework. What is the framework for health? We are doing a pastiche. 20,000 crore ka insurance yahan kar do, what is the 10-year plan about what is the architecture of health delivery you want, right? NHS style, totally private insurance, totally out of pocket. Unless you work backwards from that, there is no framework for even understanding what these allocations actually add up to, right? So it's a budget that has given up, and to be fair, all governments are responsible for this. And we haven't had a good education minister since God knows when, right? We haven't had a major health reform, serious health minister since God knows when, right? But at this point in the 21st century, again, reflects incredible pessimism about these two sectors, right? So I think it's actually a deeply sort of, pessimistic budget. One, this last point, and then I kind of end it there. How will the politics of this budget play out? I think the middle class is not going to be happy, which may not be a bad thing. It's sometimes good from an economic point of view not to keep the middle class happy. But that was a very big constituency for this government. Frankly, I think the miscommunication over this Provident Fund, the PPF thing, and the government's absolutely atrocious framing of the issue. Why can't they have done a simple thing saying, look, this is the 10-year pension architecture we want to move to. In that context, these steps make sense, right? Instead, what you got was all kinds of patronizing nonsense about how people don't know how to spend their own money, right? So the middle class is going to lukewarm, right? Farmers, that is the big rhetorical pitch in this budget. If they deliver on everything else, PMGSY, agriculture, I mean, look, irrigation has been around for a long time. As you know, the irrigation thrust is not new. Maybe 2 or 3 years' time, some turnaround. But the fact of the matter is, in the short run, when you have rural demand collapsing and a serious agrarian crisis, there is not going to be much infusion of cash in the rural economy, right? So again, what was the diagnosis? Are you actually trying to stimulate big rural demand or not? What is the extent of that, right? So I don't think people are going to sort of feel that, as it were, that there's a, there's a... So And as I said, they have frittered away, I think, almost all their political capital on, completely sort of irrelevant, at least irrelevant to the economy, other than in negatively destructive way issues. So my sense of this budget is that if one were to rate it highly, one would rate it highly for prudence, as everybody has been saying. But there are different kinds of prudence. There's one prudence which says this is prudence because we actually know what we are doing. And there's a kind of prudence which says we actually don't know what we are doing, so we might as well be prudent in this fiscal sense. I'm afraid it looks more like the second. Because as I said, we are happy we haven't been, delivered pinpricks, no injections, no big operation. But will growth be revived? We don't know. Is lack of demand the basis of growth? We don't know. Will this budget address that? We don't know. Infrastructure, see, I just saw Vinayak Chatterjee kind of saying, forget infrastructure for 2 years, right? You're not going to get a major revival. If that's the situation we are in, then actually you need a different kind of diagnosis. So we've got a prescription, no injection. I don't know whether we're going to be cured. And given our politics, Haryana, Gujarat, right, states where the BJP is losing big time ground, expect this to be a really socially conflictual year from hell. Thanks.
Thank you, Pratap. Let me make an honest confession here. Before we were having a meeting before this conference, and I had made the mistake of suggesting that why not ask Pratap to make the first presentation. Now I know why the tradition is to have him speak at the end. Because I wonder whether some of the optimism that we expressed earlier about the budget could have been sustained after his wonderful presentation that made us look a little odd. Before, now we'll start with the question answer session from the floor. But before I do that, while you sort of sharpen your wits to prepare your questions, let me quickly go over our panelists and ask a couple of questions to each of them. And I will start with Pratap. And it's been said that this budget targets the rich and wealthy. Examples are the additional dividend tax in the hands of them, even the 1% surcharge on those who are earning more than 1 crore. Where do you see this taxing the rich fit in your understanding of the politics of the budget?
See, I mean, it just reinforces the point that this is not an electorally bold budget. What you would have liked if you were really bold, I mean, the long-term strategy for the Indian state has to be increasing tax over GDP ratios. It has to be increasing the share of direct taxes, right? Not touched at all. So I don't mind actually the slight increase in taxing the rich. I mean, that's perfectly fine, and they'll have perfectly sensible ways of evading it as well. So it'll probably turn out to be sort of okay. I'm not going to lose sleep over that, but I think it does signal a sort of a search for easy solutions, and easy solutions are often non-solutions. And in that sense, I think it's worrying. I mean, I don't intrinsically mind that increase in tax, but I don't think it's accompanied by a signal. And look, if you don't begin to do this now, right, because the point about direct taxes is that it also changes the relationship between citizens and state, right, as the economic survey very rightly says. If you're not going to embark on that process now, this whole indirect tax, reliance on the indirect tax business, you'll also get very indirect services.
Let me turn to Rajat. Rajat, this budget is also being seen as ushered in great tax reforms, but there are also critics who say that many of the taxation changes actually might make India a little more protectionist. That's one. And the second question would be that what is the credibility of these dispute resolution bodies when companies are in the first place saying that I am not supposed to pay this tax, So why are you asking me to pay the tax just because I don't have to pay the penalty and interest? So is that dispute resolution meant for some telecom companies are real? And the first question is the tax structure become a little more protectionist because there are discretionary interventionist tax rate changes?
Yeah, no, so I don't think that overall we are becoming more protectionist. At least the budget doesn't reflect that overall we are becoming more protectionist. In fact, you know, a number of foreign companies now take advantage of, you know, sometimes take advantage of our WTO commitments, sometimes take advantage of, like Korea and Japan, take advantage of the FTAs to kind of sell products at low import duties in India. But you know, particularly the steel sector has been bleeding, and there's been a lot of representation made to the government to increase import duties and countervailing duties. And one of the things is that if you look at our multilateral commitments, we have our bound rates and our applied rates. There's a big wedge between our bound rates and applied rates, and therefore the kind of temptation incrementally to protect certain industries because of what Pratap mentioned is that, you know, because of greater access of the industry is bleeding, and of course there are global vulnerabilities. So, but I don't think I would go to say that in the trade regime in the external sector that overall there is a sense that we are becoming more protectionist, because I think this is the time when actually we have to really think, and this will really think especially off budget, what we are going to do in our engagement with the APEC, with the RCEP, and with TPP. I don't think, just like there isn't a vision in the budget about where we are going in certain sectors, I don't think there is a vision that we have on how we are going to address this huge global shift of trade if the TPP actually happens. That's where I think we should, and that is likely to be much more off budget. On your second question, you know, on capacity institutions and whether you know, telecom companies or any other companies are able to use the process to their advantage, and that's the point I think Pratap reiterated and I mentioned. And there is, let me read out another statement in the summary of the budget which says, comprehensive review and rationalization of autonomous bodies. I don't know what that means, rationalization of autonomous bodies, creation of dispute settlement bodies. Now, you create these bodies, but you don't have adequate capacity to be able to give the judgment. And there are multiple, I know for a fact there is multiple evidence in the Indian dispute settlement process, both jurisprudence and in regulatory bodies, that there is enormous amounts of forum shopping that is going on at the moment, especially in telecom companies. And high courts, as well as the appellate bodies, they have overlapping jurisdictions, and players are playing that game. And there is, of course, there is need for coordination, but I think there is much more of a need to build a regulatory cadre in India which is efficient, which enforces, and which people are, you know, fear to take decisions to game the system. I think that is the crying need of the hour, especially if infrastructure sector, hopefully after 2 years, begins to take off.
Okay, thank you. Let me come to Shanthi. You talked about the decline in social sector outlay as percentage of GDP, or maybe marginal increase, actually, 0.8%.
Yeah.
But if center were to say, the central government were to say that this is all because of the 14th Finance Commission, why blame me? You know, blame Dr. Reddy for raising the devolution of resources to the states from 32% to 42%. And ultimately the states will have to chip in, and why blame the central budget? What would you say?
Why pick on social sector for this? See, yes, the 14th Finance Commission has, I've already said that it has straitjacketed the government. And apart from the money that they are giving to the states, they are also giving 2.87 lakh crores to the local bodies. That is another award of the 14th State Finance Commission. So yes, I mean, that has meant that not just social sector. Actually, I was looking through the budget documents. There are many other sectors also where the monies have been drastically cut off. But there are a couple of surprises, like telecommunications has received 4 times what it was receiving last year. Now, I don't know what is going on there. I don't know what the government is doing in the telecom sector. That is, I think the budgeted amount is something like 40,000 crores. So it's a huge amount of money. So central government would be right in saying that yes, we have less money. In fact, that is the reason I feel why they have passed on these functions to the state governments and the local bodies. Water and sanitation definitely is going to go to the local bodies. It already has started, and they will be responsible for providing WhatsApp. And we know what that might lead to, you know. So that's the thing. So they would be right in saying I don't have the money. That's true.
Okay, that's fine. Shekhar, you talked about agricultural outlay, money going in large quantities to various schemes and all that. Is there reason to worry the manner in which there has been no reform in the way the handout system has been going on for the last several years, and there's virtually no subsidies reform in this budget? Is that a valid criticism?
It's extreme. It's right on target. I think again, this goes somewhat to do we know what we are trying to fix? And again, in this budget, while it appears to be that there is a very large increase in the allocation to the rural sector, the largest part of it simply is a transfer from the Ministry of Finance to the Ministry of Agriculture, Farmers Welfare and Farmers Cooperation and Welfare. So in that sense, even the transfer of resources is a bit of a sleight of hand. And much more importantly, to your point, and as I said in my presentation, the fundamental issues of the food and the fertilizer subsidy really doesn't need rocket science. We know that producer subsidies are distorting. We know the tremendous impact of free electricity on groundwater and the kind of impact it has had in North India. We'll see more of it in the rest of the country. This doesn't require rocket science, but we're not able to break through the patronage aspect of agriculture, where the state seems to know what's best for the farmer and doesn't do the basics that anybody who has any contact with agriculture knows. You need good transport links, you need good marketing, you need good water. And those are large things that an individual farmer is not able to do. All he can do with subsidized electricity is overuse it, overdraw groundwater, with fertilized subsidies on fertilizer, overuse the fertilizer. So we are straitjacketing the farmer inside. It's being used in another context, but I think these fundamentals are not being addressed. And perhaps it's because we don't know what we need to fix, perhaps because the government doesn't want to take political risks, and not just this government, every government in the last 25 years perhaps. The MSP needs to be reformed. The Food Corporation of India needs to be reformed. These are all fundamental changes where we know what to do. The problem is nobody is willing to lay out a trajectory of 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, by which time we could get it done. Let me just also very briefly say that what's missing, and here I'm resonating what Pratap said, there is no sense of urgency about our destiny. We're going to be a billion labor force or workforce by 2050. 1 billion. That's larger than any country in the world. Even in 2100, we're going to be something like 700 million working age population. And then we're all going to grow old. And a fundamental question that is not being dealt with the urgency which it deserves is India going to get rich before it gets old? Because if we don't get rich before we get old, the social conflicts that will lead to will be simply uncontrollable. And nobody's thinking, 20 years from now, where will we be if we keep going at it at this pace?
Thank you. Before we come to the floor, to the audience for ask questions, my final question to Rathin is that this is a post-pay commission budget. And if you look at the numbers, it's very difficult to get the numbers in the budget, but there is an increase for pay commission and pensions of around 93,000 crore, which is almost 0.6% of the GDP. Do you think that there is not adequate assessment of the pay commission impact and the challenges when we criticize the budget for lack of expenditure on the capital side? In a sense, the capital expenditure side as percent of GDP has indeed declined. But this is perhaps one post-pay commission budget where the government has managed to provide almost for the entire pay commission award for the next year, and yet stuck with the fiscal deficit, and therefore has accepted a marginal fall in the capex. Now, that's a government script, most probably. So how would you respond to that?
Well, I think the numbers I get are between, let me just say that when I was a member of the pay commission, we didn't have any, Government of India does not have accurate numbers for how much it pays its permanent staff. Luckily, 88% of government expenditure is on railways. There they have some idea. They hire a lot of policemen. They have some idea there. The rest of it, there was no idea. So even the government is guesstimating, plus minus 5%. So something between 70 and 90,000 crores has been provided in this budget.
93,000 extra.
Okay, if you're, because the minister gave a low number yesterday, that's why I'm a bit intrigued. Anyway, I had estimated, frankly, on 11% nominal growth rate, which the government has very kindly taken for next year, that it would, excluding railways, we would need about 0.5% of GDP. So it's well provided for. That is not a problem. Unfortunately, the public investment decline is a long-term thing. If you look at the medium-term fiscal policy statement, then you'll see consistent declines. I just want to take 1 minute, if with your permission, to respond to something Pratap said. You can look at this budget in two ways. You can look at it as a sense of profound pessimism, but you can also look at it in terms of what about Hanumantappa? I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. See, a budget is just that. It's a statement of the government's fiscal intentions. And what Shekhar is saying, what Pratap is saying, is that there has not been in this country, I think for 20 years, an articulated statement of government strategic intentions on where it needs the economy to go, which will then impact the budget. So within those constraints, I think this is a good budget. Let me give you one example. We must raise taxes and we must have a higher share of indirect taxes. Where is the agency there? The agency there comes from the fact that when you're able to get those changes happening on the basis of what is happening to your economy, then those changes come. The agency cannot be that the government takes a sort of Gosplan decision and changes its tax structure. It's not how it works. So prior to doing that, we will need to set our tax policy based on our tax bases. The first steps for that have been taken in this instrumentation, and therefore I think I would say that I'm not pessimistic about this, but I would join you in saying what about Hanumantappa in the larger context. Thank you.
Good. Now, may I invite questions from the floor, and I would request to identify yourself, and if you think you want asking this question to one of the panelists here, please identify him as well. Yes.
I know this, the mic always gets it.
That's right.
Santosh Mehrotra, Jawaharlal Nehru University. I very much endorse Pratap's view about the pessimism and the grounds on which he is pessimistic. But there is something deeper which I found very worrying. Before this government came to power, there was generalized recognition of the damaging effects of the inverted duty structure, the inverted tariff duty structure that has been prevalent for the last 10 years at least, on manufacturing capacity in our country. We should all remember that in the 25 years since the economic reforms began, manufacturing contribution to GDP has not exceeded 15%. It has been stagnant at 15%. The contribution of manufacturing to employment has barely risen from 10.5% to 12.8% in the entire 20-year period. And one of the reasons why this is the case, and this is recognized by the chambers of commerce and industry, but they are divided right down the middle between those who are importers on the one hand and those who are manufacturers on the other. One was hoping that in 3 budgets, finally in the 3rd budget, there would be some serious real action on the inverted duty structure, which is actually leading to deindustrialization in the country. And are we going to get a reversal of that? I didn't hear anything from any of the speakers. I'd love to hear something from anyone who wants to take a view on this extremely serious matter.
Thank you.
This Chadha from National Council of Applied Economic Research. I have, in fact, I would like to further reinforce what Rathin has said about the introduction of cesses, which, as you know, NCAER has a major study on GST, where the GDP itself would get a kick up of at least 1%. But my worry is that would it not make the government more lethargic in going to GST if the revenues are being raised from cesses, and how fast the government intention, and you clearly said that once GST comes into picture, cesses might be removed, but my worry is that once we start with certain taxes, the cessation of cesses may not be very easy. The second point I think Pratap has raised, I was quite confused about suddenly taking aback or suddenly confusing the middle class, as you referred to, with this EPF taxation, and people running helter-skelter in their thoughts, even if they are the middle class people. So some discussion on EPF taxation, because that is raising the revenue, a little more enlightenment on that. But the first worry is the GST and cesses confusion. The second question, Rajat, you mentioned about exports, and you said that it could have been 5%, it is 1.7% in ICRIER study. A bit more on, when you take these kinds of studies, do the right-hand side variables also take into account the trade agreements that are taking place elsewhere, even if not in India, but elsewhere, that might also have a great impact on India's exports potential. And I don't want to go into details, but yes, there is a hidden protectionism there as well if we don't study the what is happening in the rest of the world. Thank you.
Surjit, questions from you?
Actually, I have 5 questions/comments, but
Okay.
they will be specific. No philosophy there. First, on spending on health and education, and perhaps Rathin can enlighten us on this, but I think the problem in comparing Indian spending on health and education with the rest of the world is that there is a center spending, and most of the data that you get in your World Bank documents, etc., is that done by the center, not by the state. And thirdly, the additional problem with health and education statistics, comparative ones, is that private spending is not included in these statistics. So if you include center plus state plus private spending, and I'm not saying a bit about the quality of that spending and what that is getting you, but on education we spend something like 7% of GDP, and on health we spend something like 7 to 9% of GDP. The center just spends 1% of GDP on health, but that's not all the spending on health that's taking place. So that's the first factual point that I would worry about. The second one, and this is for Rajat, that the last time I looked at the real exchange rate of the RBI and its effects on anything, it was very similar to its inflation expectations model. So before you use that to say that the exchange rate is either undervalued or overvalued, please show us one time in history where you can show it has a link to our exports. Third, and this is bandied about, it's so politically correct, I'm actually quite upset that you mentioned it and Pratap mentioned it, that listen, our GDP data are all wrong. Now, let me point out.
I didn't say it's wrong.
Okay.
I didn't say.
Yeah, I'll come to your pessimism part, don't worry.
No, hang on, that's an important distinction.
No, it is that to say that, listen, let me quote you directly, that what worries me is that the GDP data shows 7 to 7.5%, and that we are very happy because it's the highest growth rate in the world, and so on and so forth. That you did say. And Rajat said, so let me just address it. Rajat also said, explicitly questioned the GDP data. Now, I wonder, Rajat, if you know that the index of industrial production, which is what is most of the objection to the new GDP data, there's very little change elsewhere, showed a 0 to 1% growth rate for the last 5 years. And I don't remember you or anybody else questioning the GDP that came out of it of something like 6%. This year, IIP data is growing at 3.2%. So I would think that if you accepted the old GDP data and the old index of industrial production data, that you should be very willing to say that 7 to 7.5% to 8% is very realistic. So before we throw dirt on the GDP data, let us just get our facts correct. And maybe the Business Standard has also committed this error. So that's the third point. The fourth point is on farmers' welfare, which was just mentioned. It turns out, yes, there's a 15,000 NABARD thing switching, but farmers for agriculture, let's be specific, agriculture is other than farmers, but in terms of landless laborers, etc., what you have is there's a 28%, read my lips, there's a 28% growth in expenditure on agriculture this year. Every other expenditure category is somewhere around 8 to 10%, such that the overall growth in expenditure is something like 10 or 9.8 or 10.8%. 28%, and this will have implications for the politics. So that was my third point.
Fourth point.
Fourth point. And the fifth point, think how much more pessimistic we would be if there was no fiscal consolidation, if the growth rate was 5%, and the inflation rate was 10%, which is what we have experienced over the last 5 years.
Unlike Sujit, I won't make 5 comments, but I will make one because there were references to the 14th Finance Commission. You see, it was not a matter of the finance, as it were, by its whim, saying that, this should be devolved to the states and so on. There is, as you know, it's a constitutional thing about the union list, the state list, and the concurrent list. And all we did was to align with that. And in that list, it is very clear that things like basic health care, education are subjects for the states, and they have been deprived of that role, for all these years. And of course, you have to build capacity. But quite frankly, you look at the fiscal performance of states and union, there is much more fiscal prudence at the state level than the union level. So let's not, sort of think that this is going to be
I meant blame in a positive sense.
Yeah, no, I'm not referring to you.
Yeah.
There were other, and in fact, Shanthi also made this remark about this devolution. She approved of it, but talked about, lack of capacity. Again, it is not a matter of just choice. The 46th and 47th Amendment wanted to empower the panchayat institution, the local government institution, and it has a list of items, 19 in the case of the panchayats, I think 29 for the union, that these are to be given to the local governments. And the Finance Commission gave a grant to incentivize this so that the states actually pass on this money to the panchayats. And of course, there is no capacity. They cannot even make accounts. In fact, one of the conditions on which this money is to go to them is precisely that they will produce 3 years of audited accounts, for which they will have, the states can actually give them money to build up that capacity and so on. I completely agree with Pratap that we really should be investing in capacity. Now, the question that I had, everybody is taking it for granted, including Surjit here, that this, the 3.5% fiscal consolidation is happening. There's an expenditure story, there's a revenue story. How is it happening? The tax revenue projections are quite reasonable, but as I have mentioned to you once before, you look at the non-tax revolution, it is complete pie in the sky. And I think that is the question I would like to ask you. Why are you not looking at the fact that, in fact, you are pretending that there's fiscal consolidation, but there's a huge hole that will show up unless you really think that the government is going to raise all that non-tax revenues by way of divestment and by way of strategic disinvestment, given the record that it had last year, which is zero strategic mobilization. Thank you.
I have two factual clarifications to start with. I think one of the panelists mentioned that the allocation for the UGC has been cut sharply. This is not really true. If you look at the demands for grants for the Department of Higher Education, you'll see that it's been split into two line items. And if you add them up, that central universities are getting slightly more than they were last year. So there's been a lot of talk as well. I remember Professor Jyoti Ghosh making the same point that, oh, this is a hit at JNU. I don't think this is true. I think this is more of an accounting change, and I think it's responsible for us to not add to the kind of atmosphere by saying JNU is being targeted. That was number one. Number two, one of the panelists mentioned that local governments are getting every year 2.87 lakh crore rupees. This was a sleight of hand by the finance minister. In fact, he kind of conflated this year's budget with the 5-year recommendation of the Finance Commission. So including last year and the next 4 years, the GPs are getting 2.87 lakh crores. But if you just look at this year's allocation, it's I think only around 80 lakh rupees. 0.8 lakh crore rupees, and that actually adds up to something around 14 lakh per gram panchayat in this country, which is really not that much for a yearly allocation. This adds to my question, which is on how do we actually go about deepening state capacity. I think it was N.T. Ramarao who once said, apart from posts and railways, there's no such thing as the government of India. And this is true for most people, right? All the centrally sponsored schemes are essentially implemented through state machinery. And irrespective of how it's funded, whether the funding comes from the union government or from the state governments, it's still finally the same officer and the same sets of people at the grassroots level who are going about doing these things. Talk about state capacity, and I completely agree, it needs investment. But I think as a collective, there's a little bit of lack of thinking among social sector groups on how one would exactly go about building capacity at the grassroots level. And the talk has been much more concentrated on the funding mechanism. If we can move forward and go ahead and figure out how to build the capacity of officers at grassroots level, I think that would be something which would be very useful.
Okay. Not a YOY growth story. Spectrum is a demand and supply story. 700 megahertz is not needed by any telecom player at this point of time, apart from Mukesh Ambani. The problem for that whole 99,000 crore number is that whatever iterations you do, or whatever outrageous iterations you do, you cannot arrive at a number which is more than 40,000 crore. At 40,000 crore, if that number materializes, that means that all the telecom companies which are listed will go down by half, just because of the amount of debt that they'll raise for funding this probable auction that they'll go into. So basically, the point I'm trying to make is, if you add up these two numbers, you're actually starting with a 1% GDP fiscal space, which is already dented. Okay, so you're starting at a number of 4.5. Now let's talk about successes on that. You're talking about strategic sale. We don't know what that fancy term is. You're talking about non-strategic sale. We don't know what will happen. And spectrum, I can say you, we are the industry, we are from the financial services industry. It's not possible. So you are actually looking at a number, very, very optimistic number, which is 3.9, which is flat year on year. That is the first point I'm trying to make. The second point is, every year when we see the GDP number, the first assumption that we say, what is the nominal growth assumption? Okay, 11%. Government of India says it's going at around 7.5%, a real number. So that actually says that you are expecting a deflator of 3.5%, roughly. That actually requires you to have a WPI inflation of 3%. Very, very unreasonable assumption at this point of time. Third layer of argument that I'm trying to make is, which is what Dr. Mehta, Mr. Mehta has made. If you see the expenditure, break it up into plan and non-plan. Plan is about 30, non-plan is about 70. Within the 70 part, if you go, They are sovereign commitments. There is interest payment, there is defense, there is cost of establishment, and there is subsidies. These are all 4 sovereign commitments, which is like covering up about 70% of the whole non-plan. So where is the space? Now the thing is, for the last 3 years, I have been looking for one single comment from the government as to how they are going to tackle about this rigidity in the non-plan expenditure. For the last 3 years, I have been looking at one single comment. I have not seen that comment.
Okay, I appreciate this this session every year. I really enjoy it, and this time I agree with all 5 of the speakers. Yes. Sorry. Can you hear me? Yeah. So I agree with all 5 of the speakers. I agree with Rathin that it's a good thing that the fiscal consolidation path was adhered to. Actually, I think our sense is that India, which has a deficit at the center of about 3 to 3.5% of GDP, and at the states of 3% of GDP, roughly speaking, gives you a deficit of 6 to 7% of GDP, which by international standards is pretty high. So sticking to the path of bringing the deficit down is a good idea. I agree with Dr. Shanthi that social spending is probably too low and should be a bit higher. And I also agree with Shekhar and Rajat that there are important infrastructure, sectoral areas where you need to spend more. So algebraically, that means I agree with Pratap that revenue needs to be higher. And I think that there is a consensus around the room that not direct tax, maybe also indirect tax to some extent, needs to be higher, that India at the general government level collects 18 to 19% of GDP in revenue, and that's a little bit low for a country at this stage of development. How do you get there? I think this is my major disappointment with the budget. The Tax Administration Reform Commission report, the strategy to modernize revenue administration, if it's there, it's buried a bit, and I don't really understand what the plan is to revamp revenue administration. A major report was delivered to the minister last year that proposes, merging the central boards of direct and indirect tax, creating a modern IRS-like revenue authority that would basically modernize the whole way revenue collection is done. And I don't see that agenda being taken forward. And I think it's something that we need to be asking. If I can just ask a couple of quick questions. One, given that the panel, some on the panel, maybe all on the panel, will be thinking about the FRBM revamp that's been proposed by the minister. My first question would be, do we, in the context of thinking about a new FRBM that involves escape clauses and counter-cyclical policy, do we also have an opportunity to revisit the question of whether the target of 6% of GDP is right? 3% at the center and 3% at the states. Is it the right target? I think if you look across countries, you can make a strong case that it should be lower than 6% of GDP. So that would be my first.
The fiscal deficit.
Sorry?
The FD.
Yeah, the deficit of the fiscal deficit at the level of the center and the states taken together. The next question is, nobody really seems to have taken up carefully whether or not whether there's a case to be made for fiscal assumption of public sector bank debt. Whether to some extent, the headwinds to growth are coming from this financial sector corporate balance sheet stress problem. And I know that it was discussed a lot before the budget was approved. There is some capital injection in the budget. Personally, I don't want to sound too Washington consensus-y, but I think I'm starting to wonder is there a case to be made for bringing the state's share in the banking sector down from 70% of GDP, which is really high by international standards. Should we be thinking about something much lower? And is there a case to be made for revisiting whether this is the way the government, the state of India, wants to tie up its capital? That's a question. And then my last question for Rajat is about the real effective exchange rate. And he made the argument that the real effective exchange rate has been appreciating, which it has been. And therefore, that's having an impact on competitiveness. I agree that there is an issue here, but we didn't discuss the fact that the big question is the inflation differential between India and its trading partners. We're all happy that the RBI is being successful in bringing inflation down from double digits to the 5 to 6% range, but almost all of your key trading partners have inflation below 2. So that means that you're losing 300 basis points of competitiveness every year because you still have inflation that's too high. Okay, so I'll stop there. Thanks.
Right, yeah, sure. Just this question and then we'll take the answer.
Thank you. Tanya Spisbar from the Australian High Commission. And speaking of G20 values, I think it's good to get a bit more gender equity in the discussion. So happy to to speak as a woman as well. Totally agree with Rajat. I wish you guys would meet together far more often. You'd certainly have an active and happy audience. I was trying to get people as a woman as well. Totally agree with Rajat. I wish you guys would meet together far more often. You'd certainly have an active and happy audience. I was trying to get people excited about my Saturday, but really pleased to see this discussion on the budget amongst you all, so thanks. I had a few specific questions of my own. As far as FII goes, I agree that BEPS and GAR are things that the Indian government should focus on, and they're very well placed. But I'm just wondering, from the perspective of trying to win inflows, what do you imagine the reactions will be by FII, where you have on the one hand an adamant in the 2014 budget statement by Jaitley and also on Monday, an adamant focus that this government is not about retrospective tax, at the same time issuing tax assessments, then saying, hey, let's waive penalties and let's waive the interest, but you have to pay your tax. What does this mean, you know, when you take into account the model BIT treaty about not wanting ISDS? Is there a rationale that you think works for foreign institutional investors? Secondly, just on the regional idea of trade agreements, including APEC, we talk about investing in capacity. As a government that's also negotiating with India for the CECA, I guess what we've noticed is the Department of Commerce is already really overstretched. The same people that work on negotiating agreements tend to work with a number of other countries. They work on the WTO. I think there are two questions for India. One, can you invest in the Department of Commerce or officials that are engaging in negotiations? And two, what is India's personality in the negotiations? So what is it that India wants to achieve? And I think that needs to be clearer as well. Is this a global power that's really looking to be part of global value chains? Is this a developing country that says the world owes India development? Where is India in this space and what does it want to achieve? And I think those questions need to be answered in the same discussions as talking about APEC membership and things of that nature. On health, I completely agree that more needs to be spent, not just because it's a luxury that people feel healthy, but it's an investment in demand, it's investment in wellness and well-being, and it's also an investment in the labour force. So I think like infrastructure, health crucially needs to be invested in. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay. I think I can start with Pratap.
So I'll be brief and address just two questions. One, I think the clarification about UGC was absolutely spot on. And I didn't say it was a half cut in financing of higher education. It has been reallocated. Some of it has been reallocated to HIFA, the Higher Education Financing Authority. What I did say was, it is a diminution in commitment to public universities. And if you actually look at what HIFA is planning to do, frankly, it's a nonsensical idea. So what is HIFA's mandate? As stated, right? Let's see how it works out, is to leverage public funds for more CSR into God knows what kind of entities. And I'm actually quite convinced in higher education, this underlying assumption that you could do something equivalent of a roads type of PPP is a bad idea. I mean, because it creates very incompatible set of accountability structures. So to me, that reallocation, I think, is a signal of waning commitment, which, to be fair, is not a creation of this government, but a signal of a commitment to, in a sense, the diminution of public universities, not one in specific. Some central may actually go better. And given what's going to happen with the pay commission and its effects on state universities, right? 6 pay commission, you essentially got a recruitment freeze then for almost 20 years, because that's how they coped with the commission payments. Let's not kid ourselves that even though there's not been an absolute cut, the architectural form in which it's been allocated does signal a weakening of public universities. But thanks for that clarification. Just one thing in response to Suji. You're absolutely right. I mean, it's not about, and certainly I have no locus standi or competence to question the issues of the accuracy of the GDP numbers or so forth. But and you are right to raise this question about what are we comparing with what? If we used an IIP number 5 years ago and that was legitimate, and the inference drawn from that was right. All I was saying was that in the presentation of the arguments, and we have to diagnose why this is the case, the phenomenon you're describing is exactly what's happening, right? It's this inconsistent picking and choosing, right? So when we want to feel good, it says 7.75%, right? And what you need, because you don't have that time series, because in the aggregate, if you're comparing 7.7 this with the old 5%, you actually have a problem because you can't compare the same thing, right? So in that sense, and Miles said that is leading to a systematic sort of misdiagnosis or a confused diagnosis, right? Those who are making the argument that you, let's say, need more public investment or stimulate demand or whatever, they're making a certain assumption about what that real dynamic actually is. And I think it behooves the government at least and to actually make all of that clear. So in some senses, I'm actually agreeing with you, but that leads to very complicated politics of what are you trying to claim credit for and what are you trying to fix?
Okay, Rathin, would you like to address some of the questions? I think it may be appropriate first to just clarify something. I was with the Minister of State for Finance at a Deutsche Bank meeting yesterday. He said something very interesting. He said it publicly, so I'll tell you. He said this government is a right of centre government. I'm quoting him. And he said it is a government that believes that the economy is supply constrained, not demand constrained, and therefore it believes that what needs to be done is to expand investment, not consumption. Now, I wish the government would do a better job. Look at a finance ministry tweet, it's disgusting. But of articulating its own premises, that was well articulated. It's not his fault that the Babus can't understand or articulate. He did say this. So, taking on to Pratap's point, I have always said I do not believe that in the medium term, on the current growth rate, we can grow at beyond 8%. If that is true, then I do not think so, because I need those investments to kick in, which ties up with Vinayak's point about we'll have to wait 2 years for infrastructure to come in. So in those circumstances, if you're already at the cycle business, I'm very skeptical. Tom knows that. I've never seen a business cycle for India. I'd love to see one. Somebody please give it to me someday. Give me a proper cycle like I see in other countries. Everyone talks counter-cyclical, top of cycle. Our whole Bombay has become addicted to using buzzwords. Nobody in Bombay has ever produced a cycle. So I would like to see this cycle. Other than the RJD, I don't see a cycle. Samajwadi Party, sorry. So forget the cycle. I'm saying that I think we are at the peak of the growth we can achieve with the supply infrastructure we have. That being the case, therefore, it makes sense to be prudent in this budget about not raising growth further. Now, if the government chooses to say that we can do a 10% next year, I profoundly disagree, and then there is collateral damage, as rightly pointed out. So that's one. I would like to respond to Ashish's points because they're coming from industry. There's a big concern with industry about these things. Look, how on earth do you think this government managed to retain 3.9%, meet its fiscal deficit target this year? When we were doing the math in September, October, I've talked to you about this, I've talked to Bombay, it looked very difficult. It looked like the government would have to find expenditure cuts of 0.15%. They have. We knew that disinvestment was not going to work. And then something happened. What happened essentially was that indirect taxes showed a buoyancy to sort of lack of buoyancy to GDP, the other way around, which was quite magnificent to nominal GDP, right? And direct tax collections ended up being rather better than we thought, with a perceptible diminution in taxpayer harassment. Oil prices. Right?
And these lovely oil prices. But there we have a cushion. There and taxes went up. But that was a policy decision, sir. That was a policy decision by government, a non-populist, courageous policy decision by government, not to pass on lower oil prices to the rich in the form of further bounties. And it would be nice if we acknowledged that. So I'm not so sure that the government is not able to take tough policy calls. We can, but that's a tough policy call. Look at the counterfactual. I could have let it pass through. And then where would we be? So that was a tough policy call. It hasn't taken many other tough policy calls, but that certainly is a tough policy call. Look at pissing off the middle class is not easy. Look at this Provident Fund mess. So there we are. So I put it to you that there maybe what we are looking for here is a 0.4% decrease in the fiscal deficit GDP ratio. If I am able to secure 12 to 12.5% nominal growth through a change in my
in my macroeconomic parameters, that will go some of the way. Some of the way we will get by cutting subsidies aggressively. Some of the way we could also get by making sure that our tax buoyancies, which we have calculated, are maintained, which are slightly more than one, by the way. Slightly more than one in most cases, especially in service tax. And then we may fall short in some areas, we may improve in some areas. If you read what the finance minister has been saying, they are expecting, and I'm skeptical, but they're expecting a couple of one-offs in terms of non-tax revenue from previous litigation to come forth next year. They're saying that part of the anticipated increase in spectrum revenues is that litigation will sort and that money will flow into the budget. So I would not be unduly concerned, but the most important thing is, during the run-up to the budget, the finance minister did ask somebody a question, so I'm told, actually I saw, that is it better to come to 3.7 and stick to that, or is it better to go to 3.5 and fail to meet it? And the answer the finance minister got, which I support, was, sir, if you say 3.5, you will get 3.5. So yes, I hear your lack of credibility. It is fully justified. The process of government in this country is not one that lends itself to confidence. I don't trust government myself in my daily life, but the fact is that now that the government is in a process of trying to establish its credibility, I think the best discipline you have is a target that the government will be forced to take tough decisions to meet. So I think it will. I will move. I think that's answered all three of your questions in a generic way. Okay. I'd like to move to what Tom said. Look, and this links with something Pratap said. We have a very interesting fiscal conundrum in this country. The 6% deficit, if you look at the 6-7% deficit without as general government, the general government deficit, only 2.1% of it on a good day will be for consumption, because the states don't borrow to consume, right? That's a pretty healthy deficit. I'm not a deficit hawk. I mean, there's no reason ipso facto why the deficit of this country should be 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 or 9. Nothing in economic theory tells me anything whatsoever. What you have is recursive modeling that tells you that. So there I'm fairly open. As long as we reduce the borrowing to consume, which is now only a problem of the central government, we can think of a larger deficit. But I think the problem is a different one. The problem is today, if you add the tax GDP ratio of the center and the states, depending on who you believe, we collect something like between 15 to 16% of GDP on taxes. Our deficit is 7%, which means out of GDP, 23% of our GDP is already devoted to the Indian states and the activities of the Indian state, where the money comes from borrowing or from taxation. The big political economy question we need to ask is, do you think the Indian state in the long term structurally should be getting a higher percentage of that GDP? That's right. That is the important structural question. And that is an ideological question partly. If your answer is yes, then fine. If your answer is no, then I'll have to do a lot of rejigging within the public finances of the state to get the money that Pratap is rightly asking for more health, more education. That is going to be impossible in the case of the center, because the bulk of central government expenditure, revenue and capital, is on capitalization of the railways. You may think that's good. It's on the Indian Army, which is optically and for public relations purposes untouchable. Unless somebody here wants to hear something about our brave men on Siachen, I'll stop there and assume that that is taken as read. And we have had a 320% increase in expenditure on the paramilitary in the last 25 years, and you go figure why that is happening. And if you get a political settlement there, you get a fiscal payback. But if you don't have the political settlement, you're not going to be able to change fundamentally the composition of the central government's expenditure to the purposes he wants, consistent with the state forming a quarter of GDP. That's our political economy challenge.
Okay, which is great. Let me just go first to Sujit's question about health and education expenditure. Yes, perhaps if you do the math right, you can see that it's actually a much greater spend. But it's been spent on the exact wrong things. Basic economics and public economics tells us what are public goods and what are private goods. And the state is spending, and I know that many people here might not agree, but we are spending on universal, publicly supported primary curative care. You don't do it. You have to spend on population-based services, water, sanitation, things that are incredibly important for the poor. Because we all have sanitation, and we all have water, and we all have medical care, but they don't. So I think it's really important. And secondly, we have downplayed the role of hospitals. And we have played up the role of insurance markets, which
don't succeed in some of the most advanced economies of the world. The richest economy in the world at $55,000 per capita has difficulty with its insurance markets. And we are trying to pretend that we will run an efficient insurance market in medical insurance in a $1,500 per capita economy. That's going to be tough. So the question is not just the quantum, but really what are we spending on? What are the political shibboleths that we are really allowing us to guide us through? And for years on end, it's now 60 years since we've been doing this. So a rethink, and I think this goes to some of the points made earlier, that where is the 10-year, 15-year horizon where we see us going? You know, it's one budget after another, we comment on it, this much, that much, but there is no long-term vision currently that is driving this country, whether it's in health and education, whether it's in taxation, direct or indirect. A number of these areas need work. This goes to Santosh Mehrotra's question also about manufacturing and where it's gone. We've missed the whole stage of unskilled, semi-skilled, medium-skilled, high-skilled manufacturing. We've jumped straight from agriculture to services. Now we are faced with the problem, where are we going to find the productive employment in our services sector? And so we now have to go back and say, oh, we better go back to manufacturing, and so make in India and make in this and make in that. But these are fundamental errors that were made back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And we are faced with this dual challenge that Pratap mentioned. We have to ride two horses. We have to still exploit the low-wage advantage that we have somewhat, yet we have to deal with IPR and innovation and supply chains and distributed manufacturing, which is where the world is going. So we can, you know, still try to reap the benefits of low-wage manufacturing, but the world's moving away from that very rapidly. So we are in, and that's where I really feel that the sense of urgency about the future is really missing in almost everything we talk about. And how to inject that, how to get that injection that Pratap wants, I think is really important in thinking about our future.
Okay, Rajat?
I completely agree with you that the inverted duty structure needed to be changed. I think in the budget, there may be opportunity to do this outside the budget as well, maybe down the line. But I think what happened was there was an intent, and I think in certain electronic items it was addressed a couple of years ago. In 2014, there was a change in the inverted duty structure for some electronic items. But I think in this budget, the attention got diverted, and so trade and customs did not receive the attention. I think a lot of time was spent on infrastructure investment, rural distress, and so on. But it's not off the table. I think that inverted duty structure, the rationalization, is not off the table. But it may. And if you read, Arvind's previous economic survey and this economic survey, and you link the Chakravyuh, talk about socialism. We moved from socialism to market without exit. You need to reform the labor laws, and you need to take up manufacturing to 25%, and whether manufacturing with its institutional dynamism, which you've done so much work on the informal sector, whether that's the right way, whether this institutional dynamism of contractual and informal employment will be able to address the problem, which really manufacturing was sought to do, which is to kind of employ, as Shekhar said, the low-skilled, unskilled workers China did, whether manufacturing would be the panacea to address our problems. So there is some discussion in the previous economic survey as well as this economic survey, and inverted duty structure is a part of an overall design for Make in India and to kind of trigger manufacturing in India, but it could still well be done. I think it's on the table. It's just that in this budget it hasn't been addressed, but it needs to. I agree. It needs to be addressed. On the question, on Rajesh's question on, what are the other right-hand side variables in that regression? Well, as I mentioned, we've got income, which is the export-weighted shares of our partner countries, which account for about 70% of our trade, and we've got the real effective exchange rate. But, a variable that looks at the trade agreements of our partner countries and the other trade agreements in the world, that's not there. But as I said, it is work in progress. And I dare say we will be able to do that as a working paper, and you should watch out ICRIER's website for this. But I think it is going to be addressed. And on Tom's question of our inflation differentials being high, absolutely, and that's contributing to the appreciation of the real effective exchange rate. And that, I don't know whether it's 300 basis points, but that does contribute to the lack of competitiveness of our exports. On Surjit's question of not the exchange rate, the other question on the GDP numbers. Well, if one disregards, in addition to what Pratap said, if one disregards the new series completely, I mean, just go with the old series and look at some, we haven't done this in ICRIER, but if you believe some of the projections that are done on the old series by certain investment houses, and those numbers have come out in the recent past, those numbers look quite low. Some of them are at 5% for the current year. Up to about 5% if you do that. So even if you're not picking and choosing on the current series of IIP, stretched corporate balance sheet, and high growth, I'm not disbelieving the numbers, as Pratap said. I'm not disbelieving. All I said was that there should be some way to reconcile these numbers. And as you said, the IIP is now 3.2%, and we could potentially grow at 7.5%, 8%. And then one will have to look at the investment, the private sector investment, the ICORs, and so on. And I haven't done that, but we could do that. Well, we could, but disregard all these numbers and just project the old series, as I said, and the numbers don't come out to be too rosy. Last comment that I would make is on what is the vision for trade. I've said this during my presentation, and I think Shekhar alluded to it as well, participation in global value chains, and what is our vision. I think that vision needs to be developed on whether we are going to be in TPP, whether we are not going to be in TPP, whether we are a more articulate. There are people who are talking about it, but a government, Ministry of Commerce driven view of where we are headed, whether it's RCEP, whether it's TPP. TPP, I mean, frankly, China is quite ready to get into the TPP even as we speak. India, in terms of its positioning on TPP, there's a lot of domestic structural reform, especially on state-owned enterprises, intellectual property, labor, all of that. We need a lot of domestic structural reform before we can actually think of becoming a member. But at least we should, begin to plan now if there is a vision to join the TPP, and if that means a lot of trade diversion for us. Views are mixed on this, by the way. Even within the government, views are mixed, whether it's a spectrum. Rathin has already, I share the pessimism that with already stressed balance sheet in the telecom sector, with huge amounts envisaged to be got from spectrum auctions, and with data and net neutrality, all those debates happening, and stressed balance sheets and the financial health of the telecom sector, that kind of money from spectrum auctions. There will be some renewals and there will be some new spectrum that will be auctioned as well. But that looks iffy, even if telecom sector recovers. Lots of other questions on recapitalization of banks and so on. I think those are interesting questions, but
thank you, Rajat. Shanthi, would you like to come in on the social sector issues here?
I don't have too many questions, only a couple of comments, I think.
Yeah.
I would take your comment first. I did not say that the state governments needed capacity development. My concern was more about the panchayats, right? And I have worked with capacity development programs at the municipalities level in Tamil Nadu, and I know that these things can work. That was on financial management and accrual-based system of accounting. It worked beautifully in Tamil Nadu, and all municipalities converted to this accrual-based system. It can be done. But panchayats, it's more like a concern rather than a criticism. One does not want to, criticize the whole notion of fiscal federalism. What have we achieved being Delhi-centric? In the last 60 years, what sort of fantastic achievements have we had in social sectors? I think moving development away, especially in the social sector, to governments, levels of government that are closer to the people, I think it's an extremely welcome move. Only thing is, there are caveats. I know that the Finance Commission itself talks about capacity building, and they have said that the state governments will do the necessary and so on, but we'll have to wait and see how that goes. I wish them luck.
Okay,
On the other point about healthcare spending and education spending and having to look at both public and private spending, I take your point. That is how we should normally look at it. But the thing is, I am talking about that 50-60% of India's population that needs public health care and public education. Because this is the 60% of India's population that cannot pay 7.5 lakhs for an open heart surgery or 5 lakhs for a kidney transplant, whatever it costs nowadays. So I am talking about them, and from their perspective, if you see, the total amount of 7% of GDP that is being invested in the social sector is awfully small. It's woefully small. That was the point that I was trying to make. And in any case, who is to sort of say what is enough? When do we say what is enough? I mean, you can never say that. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. You look at the HDI numbers. 5 years of average schooling, is that acceptable for us? Never mind what 15% is being invested in education sector. Is 5 years of average schooling acceptable? So, that is the way I would like to look at these problems. Not look at it from percentages allotted, but from the point of view of what has come out of this. What is the outcome? That is my concern.
Okay,
Two very pointed, direct questions. One to Dr. Mehta. Somebody amongst the panelists said something beautiful, that there's a sense of urgency about our destiny, and going ahead planning that specifically for the health sector. So do you think that if there is some sort of an index, for example, a health transparency index, which talks about analyzing allocations and spending state and center-wise, that would be able to inform the country better about health decisions, and like we're talking about prioritizing health or prioritizing expenditure for the social sector? That's one. My second question is on agriculture, is to Dr. Shah or anybody else who would like to take it. I stand a little worried today because a lot of the media and some of us here applaud the government for saying that this is a pro-agricultural budget, which it may be, but also applauding the government saying they have a roadmap for the country now. I will be happy if I stand corrected today, but I don't think that a fiscal intention or just revival of budgetary allocations for irrigation, for creation of jobs, is any sort of a reflection of a government having a roadmap for something like agriculture. It is sad that it took 2.5 years for this country to have a relook at something like Manrega. I'm not saying it is the most beautiful scheme. I know it's very handout in nature, but if you had totally dismissed it, you probably didn't buy to the model. And then after 2.5 years, you don't come up with anything new. You revive a similar scheme. You don't even put any new additions or gender-specific roles in it. And it's so easy to say that you put a sum of money into that scheme and it'll give you new jobs. Dr. Shah, I'd like to ask you if it is so simple for a government to just make an allocation and say you can double the number of farm incomes in a country which is struggling with a huge agrarian crisis. I'm sorry, but it's not about doubling farmer incomes, but right now it's about that farmer who does not even hold a land substantial enough to be called his or her own. Similarly, about crop insurance, we all know that the number of people even trying to avail crop insurance is such a small number. And also, I think the whole game about insurance is way more complicated, and it's sad that the finance minister tried to sell this again and tried to get this as a populist measure in terms of the agriculture sector. So Dr. Shah, your comments on creating jobs so quickly, it'll be wonderful if they can do so, and on crop insurance.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I'm Bharun Mitra from Liberty Institute. I had a question for Dr. Mehta particularly, but in general on the politics of the situation, because I think it is really critical. And one distinction that I seem to feel this time round is, in the past, whenever we have had political confrontation, the attempt by most sides, particularly the governing side, had been to reduce the high voltage campaigns on which is raising the conflict bar. This time round, we seem to be deliberately wanting to get into political conflict. And my question is, if that is indeed the case, then is that actually a strategy to avoid or divert attention from the economic challenges that all of you mentioned?
The investments in urban areas, I mean, is the shift towards agriculture just a course correction, or is it a short-term response to rural distress? And have we abandoned the emphasis on cities? I mean, I thought that one of the good things about this government was that they had signaled an intention to take our cities more seriously. And even for rural areas, as a long-term path out of poverty, you want to be focusing on cities. So have we shifted away entirely and into agriculture, or are we still going to focus? Is there sufficient allocation for the urban agenda? So that's one question. And the second, I think maybe it's for Pratap. For those of us who need to try and understand, what is the government's long-term strategy, and we're constantly looking at speeches and documents, every year I come to this budget seminar and one or the other person says that the budget is just an annual document, don't read too much into it. There's somewhere the government should be signaling long-term intent. It used to be the plan. I suppose it was supposed to become the Niti Aayog, but the Niti Aayog has either not taken off, or they have signaled things and haven't put them in the public domain. What is it that we should be looking at? It's just the speeches of the Prime Minister or something else?
Any other questions? Yeah, I think we'll take only two more questions. Yeah.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the speech. My question is, the government has come with the phrase minimum government and maximum governance when it came in power. So given this context, how much the government has put its focus in this budget in improving the level of governance?
So my name is Sandhya from NCAER. My question is to Dr. Rathin Roy, and this is regarding base erosions and profit shifting, which is happening by multinational corporations in India. And this is with reference to a study from NIPFP and one reference from ICRIER study. So because India is a country with very high level of corporate taxation, which is around 30%, and the vision of the government is to reduce it to 25%. But so what do you think, what is exactly happening for this? So current budget, including tax rates and all the exemptions, finance minister said that corporate taxation is going to be around 29%. So it's not a major change, and they have proposed this reduction for like last 2 years. So what is your view on this part? And second is, our government has also proposed to follow a range of fiscal deficit to be targeted rather than a point. And so how do you think this is going to help? This is probably going to make government more relaxed in achieving fiscal consolidation over time, or some advantages over. Thank you.
Okay. I think at the moment there's no option but to just triangulate. There's a lot of stuff happening, and I mean, I think one way of thinking about it is, very frankly, what this budget signals is the basic parameters have been pretty constant for the last 10 years, right? Smart cities is redo, JNURM redux. I actually don't buy this thing that this government has a special emphasis, which the last one did. We are back to Narega. All the other stuff has been talked about before. I think the question is, what's the balance between the urgent and the important, right? So in a sense, you get political flack. There's 2 years of bad monsoon. So you say, well, let's go and signal something sort of, right now. I think, so in that sense, there is probably a very deep political consensus actually on, so nobody even feels the need to articulate, right? What that balance is. I mean, there isn't actually a major difference, PMGSY is UPA, Narega is UPA, irrigation is actually a pretty old thing. It's just that when you didn't have crisis, when you had 10 years of good monsoon, we just let that ball drop, right? So I think the real seesaw that's happening is between this kind of what's the urgent and what's the important. I think the strategic bit, which I think relates to the second question in a sense about, is about health, is that I would probably now look at it more in a sense sectorally, right? Which is, so one is the diagnostics question. And clearly that's, the economic survey is supposed to be that diagnostics, right? And even that survey is in a sense, absolutely wonderful, but it's again torn between, there's the immediate diagnostics, growth is slowing down, what do we do? And then there's the kind of the long, wonderful list of sort of all the, but what we probably need is in a sense these kind of sectoral diagnostics, right? Which is, okay, pensions. What is the framework we want for pensions 15, 20 years from now? Healthcare. Should we be strategizing for a public health system, or should we be strategizing for a purely private? What's the framework? Education, right? What's the mix of public-private you actually want? So what I would actually like to see is those kinds of sectoral frameworks, in light of which then a lot of interventions and reforms make sense, right? And that is what the Planning Commission or the Niti Aayog now should be sort of doing. But I suspect what they'll end up with is a bit of project implementation, a bit of fighting, a bit of residual sort of analysis. But you need those sector-specific frameworks.
Okay. Rathin, you want to address just a couple of few direct questions. I want to sort of see. I think there are two other dimensions that I like to add. Very important point Pratap is making. They're not trivial at all. Don't forget, this country is fundamental. Well, the first point I want to make is these medium-term visions of where a country ought to go are normally articulated by political parties before they come to government and contest the political terrain. So when they come to government, what the civil service then does is help them build enabling frameworks if they go wrong to articulate these. We do not have this process in our country because what everyone wants in the long term, the Prime Minister of India has said very clearly. When he first came to power, he said, these are the sort of end results I want. House for everybody, I can't remember, decent work, blah, blah, blah. So we know what we want. But we don't have a framework of how to get there because we don't have a disagreement even on how to get there. In the US, you'd have different views between Democrats and Republicans on how to achieve, if you like, a common public policy. Second problem is that this is not a rules-based country, this is a discretion-based country. And discretion is the enemy of the long term. And the civil services power comes from discretion. And the tax administration's power comes from discretion. And my policy influence comes from discretion. Because I'm asked questions every day, it keeps me permanently relevant. Nobody's asking me to write, a 4-year tax policy plan. What I get is calls from the finance ministry, ye GST ka RNR theek kar do, ye America pe kitna spending kharab hua. So that rot, until that changes, I think this larger thing will not happen. So within that, yes, we work, as you say, within the possible and hope that things change. And third, don't forget we're a gerontocracy. And we have been one for 20 years. So as I grow older, I find my willingness to think about telescopic foresight goes down. So why do you expect people who are in their 60s and 70s to have telescopic foresight? Anyway, on the question of, you asked me two precise questions on the fiscal deficit. I'd like to just respond to those and stop. Oh dear, I've lost the page. Why don't you move on in the interest of time and I'll come back to that page.
Yeah, agriculture and... Yeah, so I don't profess to have answers to very profound questions about how you actually incentivize agriculture in the right way. We've essentially adopted a my-bap approach to agriculture. That needs a fundamental change in thinking about how agriculture can be market responsive and how we can provide the basic minimum protection that's required because of commodity price fluctuations, because of weather, because of a range of different things. But the world over, countries have done it, and some countries do it with great profligacy, some do it with great parsimony, all depending on their ability and the role of the farm sector in those countries. So it's not rocket science, but we are embedded in a system that does not want to get out of that my-bap attitude. And I think that's fundamentally the problem. So we throw all these things, an insurance scheme, which really cannot work, or it cannot be sustained, to farm and fertilizer subsidies. So
it requires this long-term thinking and where we are going. Just one quick thought, there needs to be somebody, some group, whether it's, I guess it has to be in South Block, a group of 10, 15 men and women who do nothing but worry about the future. And everything that is going through the system, as it's going through, they ask themselves, and they're empowered to ask that question, what is this going to mean 15 years from now? And then work back and say, well, this doesn't make sense. That's not the way the world is going. We can't work with a tax GDP ratio that we have. It's just unthinkable. And I don't know, we don't have that group that's insulated from the day-to-day firefighting, that is used to and only empowered and required to think about the future, 10 years from now, 15 years from now. Because had we started 15 years back, we probably would be a little better off today. So I would urge, I don't know, whoever is the influence maker here, there are many people who write all the time, please think about something about our future.
Rajat, you would like to come in on the issues?
Just very quickly, I really like that question on agriculture and also Rinku's question on cities. So let me make a quick point. I defer to Ashok Visandas, who's sitting here, chairman of the Agricultural Costs and Prices Commission, and my colleague Ashok Gulati, who's not here, but he's done. But I think that question on agriculture needs to be addressed very, very seriously. So, and after all, the budget is just a, as you rightly said, it's a method of allocation. You can't expect it to fix the problems, but those problems need to be fixed. And climate change will only make it much worse than the problem is. And so therefore, Shekhar's alluded to this, groundwater, subsidies, fertilizers, and production yields that are going to go down, production shortages, and so on and so forth. So I think that's a terribly important question. There is, there are bits and pieces that are, scattered around, but they need to be integrated and a consistent policy on agriculture. So you have the agricultural price marketing, APMC acts that are going to be repealed and modernized. Should you continue to grow rice in the Punjab? Should you continue to grow sugarcane in Maharashtra? These are important questions, and they need to be addressed. So I really like that question, and especially because you're going to see fragmentation, you're going to see land given up for commercial, for urbanization, for infrastructure development. So it's likely that area under production, apart from being fragmented, as you said, is also likely to come down. So these are very serious questions that we need to address. On Rinku's point, I think when I alluded in my presentation to urban and how cities are going to be the engines of growth, I actually had the same idea, and I went to the budget, what you're saying, and tried to see whether there's any allocation for cities. And
of income. I think as a country we need to develop some kind of a human resource management strategy as to how we are going to rehabilitate these people and get them into alternate occupations.
Okay, I think Rathin has found his question.
So, yeah. Capitalization, I just refer you to what the Minister of State for Finance said yesterday and the Finance Minister said. This is actually phase 2 of bank recapitalization. Phase 1 is already over, which was the benchmark governance reforms and the identification of where we can have recovery with respect to stranded assets. It's only after that resolution process is over that you think about bailing out anything. So you have that calibrated bailout happening this year, which I happen to think is inadequate but inevitable given the fiscal deficit target. Second, on the corporate tax rate, madam, the problem is that nobody pays 30%. Nobody. And the bigger you are, the less you pay. The average effective corporate tax rate for companies over 500 crores is 22.56%, and the average overall in the sample is 24.3%. So what you're getting here is a tax increasing measure. The government is saying that it will get rid of exemptions, which is why this happens, lower the corporate tax rate, and thereby make more money also. It's the equivalent of the Laffer curve in the corporate sector, if I ever saw one. I'm very excited that we're going to do this. But let's see, because there's Ambani, Adani, lots of people are going to lose if this happens, and I don't know whether that is going to work out politically. The other question you asked me was the FRBM. This is very important, and I'm so happy that we can conclude on a fiscal note, since this is about the budget. Look, I think there are 3 questions that this FRBM review are going to ask. They're not going to be about the fiscal deficit target. Should we be worrying more about borrowing to consume, which is euphemistically called here the quality of the fiscal deficit, than the total amount we borrow? Because there are very good reasons to worry about the total amount we borrow. There are good reasons to worry about how much we borrow to consume. Should we be taking a fresh look at FRBM for general government. So rather than have an architecture where you have individual states forming FRBMs and the center doing one, should we have a better articulated, generalized FRBM with obligations on the center which are linked to obligations of the states in a calibrated way, right? Third, should we be looking in this FRBM at the institution of a medium-term fiscal roadmap from which the FRBM derives, rather than imposing an FRBM constraint and then using that to derive a medium-term fiscal roadmap? So this is a very welcome, fresh exercise. It is not an attempt to justify raising fiscal deficit targets, even though that may happen as a consequence of this exercise. Thank you.
I am supposed to sum it up, but given the range and richness of this discussion, summing up is almost impossible. So what I thought I would do instead is do a kind of a voting on 3 key issues, and I would request everybody in the House, excluding the panelists because they are biased partners now, to respond to those questions, and let us see where we reach on the idea of this budget. So I would request you to raise your hands if you agree with that. So number one, a question on which we seek your opinion is, how many of you think that this budget is transformational or breaks fresh ground? 1, 2, 3. So I think the vote is very clear. Number 2 question is, are the numbers, the projections, both the revenue and the expenditure side, are realistic? 1, 2, 3.
10, 15.
Same 3 or 4 people? Okay. A little more, I think. I think you're right. I think the more.
15.
Okay, the more number of people. Okay, the last question is, does the budget address the growth challenges of the economy? Just one.
You have to be consistent.
I think you know, I think you know, I would be repeating myself if I were to say that this budget is indeed very pessimist. So with these words, I think we can close the session.
Thank you very much for being such patient listeners, and you took part in this budget discussion. Can be very boring at times, but thank you once again for being very, very willing participants. Thank you. Thank you.
Kali